The morning mist clung to the Blue Ridge Mountains like the breath of ancient spirits, something William Two Moons understood in his bones. At 53, he had spent more years tracking these Carolina highlands than most men spent in their entire careers, his weathered hands as familiar with reading sign as a scholar with books. The Cherokee blood that flowed through his veins carried the memory of countless generations who had walked these same ridges, hunted these same valleys, and whispered warnings about things that moved in the deepest shadows of the old-growth forest. William adjusted the worn leather strap of his grandfather's hunting pack, feeling the familiar weight of 3 days' worth of supplies settling against his shoulders. The pack had been handcrafted in 1962 by his grandfather, Joseph Two Moons, using traditional Cherokee techniques passed down through 7 generations. Every stitch, every piece of sinew, every carefully tanned hide had been prepared according to the old ways. The leather had aged to a deep amber color, soft as deer skin but tough as rawhide, and it carried the faint scent of wood smoke and sage that never quite faded. Inside the pack, William had organized his gear with the methodical precision of a man who understood that survival in the wilderness depended on preparation and respect for the land. His knife, a custom-forged blade of high-carbon steel with a bone handle carved from elk antler, rested in a sheath his grandmother had beaded with traditional Cherokee patterns. The blade itself was 6 inches long, perfectly balanced for both skinning game and defending himself if necessary. Alongside the knife, he carried a compact first aid kit containing antiseptic, bandages, pain medication, and a small suture kit, essential items for a man who often hunted alone in areas where the nearest hospital was 40 miles away. His rifle, a Remington Model 700 in .30-06 caliber, had been his constant companion for over 20 years. The wooden stock bore the scars of countless hunting trips, each nick and scratch a memory of successful hunts and close calls. He had hand-loaded the ammunition himself, using bullets designed for maximum stopping power while minimizing meat damage. The scope, a Leupold 3 to 9x40, had been zeroed perfectly at his home range, and he carried backup iron sights in case of scope failure. In the rifle's sling, he had woven a small medicine bundle containing tobacco, sage, and cedar, offerings to honor the spirits of the animals he might take and to ask for their blessing on his hunt. The area William planned to hunt lay deep in the Pisgah National Forest, a section of the Blue Ridge Mountains that remained largely untouched by human development. The terrain was challenging even for an experienced hunter. Steep ridges covered in dense rhododendron thickets, narrow valleys carved by fast-flowing mountain streams, and vast stretches of old-growth forest where massive hemlocks and white oaks created a canopy so thick that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. It was country that demanded respect, where a single misstep could send a man tumbling down a rocky slope or into a hidden ravine. This particular hunting ground held special significance for William and his family. His great-grandfather had hunted these mountains before the establishment of the National Forest, back when Cherokee families still lived in scattered settlements throughout the region. According to family oral history, this area had always been rich with game, deer, bear, turkey, and smaller animals that provided sustenance through the long mountain winters. But the old stories also contained warnings about certain valleys and ridgelines where strange things had been observed, places where even the most experienced hunters felt an unexplained unease and chose to make camp elsewhere. William's destination was a remote valley known locally as Whispering Creek Hollow, named for the constant murmur of a small stream that wound through its center. The valley sat approximately 15 miles from the nearest Forest Service road, accessible only by foot along an old Cherokee hunting trail that few modern hikers knew existed. The trail itself was unmarked and often obscured by fallen logs and thick undergrowth, but William could follow it blindfolded after decades of use. His father had first brought him to this valley when he was 12 years old, teaching him to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of game, the faint deer paths that crisscross the forest floor, the territorial scratches bears left on tree bark, the distinctive wallows where wild boar had rooted for acorns and grubs. The weather forecast called for 3 days of stable conditions. Partly cloudy skies with temperatures in the mid-50s during the day and dropping to the low 30s at night. A light frost was expected on the second morning, which would help preserve any game he might harvest and make tracking easier in the early dawn hours. William had planned his trip to coincide with the new moon, ensuring maximum darkness for the nocturnal movement patterns of the animals he hoped to encounter. The absence of moonlight would also allow him to observe the natural sounds of the forest without the visual distractions that often masked the subtle audio cues that revealed animal presence. As William began his hike into the mountains, the familiar rhythm of his boots against the forest floor created a meditation that connected him to generations of Cherokee hunters who had walked this same path. Each step was deliberately placed, minimizing noise while maintaining a steady pace that would carry him to his destination by midday. His breathing fell into a natural pattern that matched his stride, a technique his grandfather had taught him for maintaining endurance during long mountain treks. The old man had always said that hunting was as much about becoming part of the forest as it was about finding game, and that meant moving through the landscape with the same quiet confidence as the animals that called it home. The trail climbed steadily through mixed hardwood forest dominated by towering oak and hickory trees. Their canopy created a natural cathedral overhead, with shafts of sunlight filtering through the golden autumn leaves to illuminate patches of forest floor, carpeted with decades of fallen leaves. The air carried the rich sense of decomposing vegetation, pine resin, and the clean smell of mountain streams. Occasionally, William caught the musky odor of deer sign or the sharper smell of fox, confirmation that the area remained rich with wildlife despite increasing hunting pressure from other areas of the forest. About 3 miles into his hike, William paused at a natural overlook that provided a panoramic view of the surrounding mountains. The Blue Ridge stretched away in all directions, ridge after ridge of forested peaks disappearing into the blue-gray haze that gave the mountains their name. From this vantage point, he could see no sign of human habitation, no roads, no buildings, no power lines cutting through the forest. It was a view that had remained essentially unchanged for hundreds of years, a reminder of what the entire region had looked like before European settlement transformed most of the landscape. Using his grandfather's binoculars, a pair of military surplus field glasses from the Korean War era, William scanned the valleys below for any sign of recent animal activity. The lenses were heavy and not as sharp as modern optics, but they had served his family well for over 60 years, and he trusted their reliability. Through the binoculars, he spotted several deer trails converging near a small meadow approximately 2 miles southeast of his position. The convergence suggested a reliable water source and feeding area that would be worth investigating once he established his base camp. William's base camp was located at the head of Whispering Creek Hollow, where a natural shelf of rock provided both protection from the wind and a commanding view of the valley below. His father had shown him this spot 40 years earlier, and William suspected that Cherokee hunters had been using it for centuries before that. The rock shelf was just large enough for a single tent and small fire ring, and a spring emerging from the cliff face provided a constant supply of fresh water. Most importantly, the position offered multiple escape routes if bad weather or other dangers made it necessary to leave quickly. Setting up camp required careful attention to both comfort and safety. William selected a flat area for his tent that would remain dry even in heavy rain, positioning it so that the entrance faced away from the prevailing wind direction. His tent was a high-quality four-season model designed for mountain conditions, with a reinforced floor and rainfly that could withstand the sudden storms common in the Blue Ridge. Inside the tent, he arranged his sleeping bag, a down-filled bag rated for temperatures well below freezing, and his sleeping pad, an insulated foam mat that would protect him from the cold ground. The fire ring was positioned downwind from his tent and surrounded by rocks to contain the flames and reflect heat efficiently. William gathered dry wood from the surrounding forest, selecting a combination of hardwoods for long-burning coals and softwoods for quick kindling. He built his initial fire using traditional Cherokee methods, striking steel against flint to create sparks that ignited a tinder bundle made from shredded cedar bark. The process took longer than using modern fire starters, but it connected him to his ancestral traditions and ensured he could make fire even if his modern equipment failed. As the sun began to set on his first day in the mountains, William prepared a simple but nutritious meal using ingredients he had packed for the trip. He started with a base of wild rice, a grain that had sustained his ancestors through countless generations, and added dried venison that he had prepared using traditional jerky-making techniques. The meat had been cut into thin strips, seasoned with salt and native herbs, and dried slowly over a low fire until it achieved the leathery texture that would preserve it for months without refrigeration. To this base, he added rehydrated vegetables and wild herbs that he had gathered along the trail, ramps, wild ginger, and watercress that added both nutrition and flavor to the meal. The evening air carried the sounds of the forest settling into its nocturnal rhythms. Owls called from the dense hemlock groves, their haunting voices echoing off the surrounding ridges. The stream that gave the valley its name provided a constant background murmur, occasionally interrupted by the splash of a beaver or muskrat moving through the water. In the distance, William could hear the howl of coyotes communicating with pack members scattered across the mountainous terrain. These were the normal sounds of a healthy forest ecosystem, familiar and comforting to a man who had spent his life in the wilderness. But as full darkness settled over the valley, William began to notice something that struck him as unusual. The normal chorus of night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the calling of tree frogs, the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth seemed muted compared to what he typically experienced in this area. It wasn't complete silence, but rather a subdued quality that suggested the forest's smaller inhabitants were exercising unusual caution. In his decades of hunting experience, William had learned to pay attention to such subtle changes in animal behavior, as they often indicated the presence of a major predator or some other disturbance that had put the wildlife on edge. As he banked his fire for the night and prepared to turn in, William performed the evening ritual his grandfather had taught him. He offered tobacco to the four directions, speaking quietly in Cherokee to acknowledge the spirits of the land and ask for their protection during the night. He thanked the forest for accepting his presence and requested permission to hunt the following day, promising to take only what he needed and to use every part of any animal he might harvest. These rituals weren't mere superstition to William. They were practical acknowledgements of his place within the larger web of life that sustained the mountain ecosystem. Inside his tent, William arranged his gear so that everything would be within easy reach if he needed to dress quickly during the night. His rifle leaned against the tent wall near his head, loaded but with the safety engaged. His boots sat ready at the foot of his sleeping bag, and his jacket hung within arm's reach. These precautions were standard practice for solo hunting in remote areas, where unexpected weather, wildlife encounters, or medical emergencies could require rapid response. Despite his careful preparations and the familiar comfort of his sleeping bag, William found himself lying awake longer than usual on his first night in the valley. The subdued quality of the forest sounds continued to naggle at his awareness, creating a subtle sense of unease that he couldn't quite identify. He had experienced this feeling before in other locations, usually in areas where recent bear activity or other natural events had temporarily disrupted the normal patterns of wildlife behavior. Still, something about this particular silence felt different, more intentional somehow, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. When sleep finally came, it was filled with fragmented dreams of his grandfather's stories about the old days, when Cherokee hunters spoke of creatures that walked upright through the deepest parts of the forest but were not quite human. These stories had been passed down through generations, cautionary tales that served to remind hunters to approach the wilderness with proper respect and humility. In his dreams, William heard his grandfather's voice warning him to pay attention to the signs the forest provided, to trust his instincts even when logic suggested there was nothing to fear. The second day dawned clear and cold, with a light frost covering the forest floor and creating intricate patterns of ice crystals on the fallen leaves. William woke before sunrise, a habit developed over decades of hunting that allowed him to be in position when game animals emerged from their bedding areas to feed in the early morning light. He dressed quickly in the cold air, pulling on layers of clothing designed to keep him warm, while allowing the freedom of movement necessary for stalking through dense forest terrain. His morning routine began with rekindling his fire and preparing a hot breakfast that would provide the energy needed for a long day of hunting. He brewed strong coffee using beans he had roasted himself, appreciating the warmth and caffeine that would help him maintain alertness throughout the day. His breakfast consisted of oatmeal, enriched with dried fruit and nuts, providing complex carbohydrates and protein that would sustain him during hours of physical activity in challenging terrain. After breakfast, William carefully cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition, ensuring that everything was in perfect working order. He applied a thin layer of gun oil to prevent moisture damage and verified that his scope remained properly zeroed by dry firing at a distant rock formation. These maintenance tasks were critical for ensuring reliable performance when a shooting opportunity presented itself, and William had learned never to take the proper function of his equipment for granted. The frost on the ground made tracking conditions nearly perfect, as any animal movement would leave clear prints in the crystalline coating on the forest floor. William began his hunt by following a well-worn deer trail that led from the valley floor up onto a bench of land where white oaks dropped acorns that provided crucial nutrition for the local wildlife. His movements were deliberate and quiet, each step carefully placed to avoid breaking twigs or rustling leaves that might alert nearby animals to his presence. About half a mile from his camp, William discovered the first sign that this day would be different from his expectations. Pressed deep into the soft earth beside the creek was a footprint unlike anything he had seen in 40 years of tracking in these mountains. The print was roughly human in shape, but significantly larger, approximately 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at its broadest point. The depth of the impression suggested that whatever had made it possessed considerable weight, probably 300 pounds or more. Most disturbing were the clearly defined toe marks, 5 distinct digits that showed this was not the paw of any known animal, but rather something with a foot structure similar to a human's, but scaled up to impossible proportions. William knelt beside the track for several minutes, studying every detail and trying to process what he was seeing. His first instinct was to look for evidence that someone was playing an elaborate hoax, perhaps using carved wooden feet or some other device to create false tracks. But the depth and clarity of the impression, combined with the natural way it pressed into the earth, suggested that this was a genuine footprint created by the weight and movement of a living creature. The edges of the track showed the characteristic compression patterns that occurred when flesh and bone pressed against the ground, details that would be nearly impossible to fake convincingly. More troubling than the size of the print was its freshness. The frost that covered the surrounding ground was absent from inside the footprint, indicating that it had been made after the temperature dropped below freezing during the night. This meant that something large and unknown had passed by this spot just a few hours earlier, possibly while William was sleeping less than half a mile away. The thought sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold mountain air. Following the line of the creature's passage, William discovered additional tracks leading deeper into the forest. The stride length between prints measured over 6 feet, suggesting a creature with legs much longer than any humans. The tracks followed no recognizable trail, but instead moved directly through the forest in a straight line, apparently unconcerned with obstacles like fallen logs, thick undergrowth, or steep terrain that would force a human to seek easier passage. Whatever had made these tracks possessed both the size and strength to simply push through barriers that would stop most other creatures. As William followed the track line, he began to notice other signs of the creature's passage. Branches at the 7 and 8 foot level showed fresh breaks where something had pushed through without ducking or going around. Small trees had been bent aside and not sprung back to their original positions, indicating considerable force applied at a height well above what any known animal could reach. Most unsettling were the claw marks scraped into the bark of several large trees, gouges that appeared to have been made by fingernails or claws significantly larger and stronger than those of any bear. The tracks led William deeper into the forest than he had originally planned to hunt that day, drawing him along a route that paralleled the creek but remained in the dense cover of old-growth timber. As he followed the trail, he became increasingly aware that the unusual quiet he had noticed the previous evening was even more pronounced in this area. The normal bird songs and small animal sounds that should have filled the forest were almost completely absent, creating an eerie silence broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the occasional crack of a twig under his boots. After following the tracks for nearly 2 hours, William reached a point where they disappeared onto a rocky outcropping that revealed no further sign of the creature's passage. The tracks simply ended at the edge of the rocks, with no indication of which direction the creature had gone from there. William spent considerable time searching the surrounding area for any continuation of the trail, checking soft spots in the earth, examining vegetation for signs of disturbance, and looking for any other evidence that might reveal where the creature had gone. It was during this search that William heard the first sound that would haunt his memories for years to come. From somewhere deep in the forest, perhaps a quarter-mile away, came a rhythmic knocking sound, unlike anything in his experience. The sound consisted of 3 distinct knocks, each one loud enough to carry clearly through the dense forest and spaced exactly 3 seconds apart. The knocks were followed by a period of silence lasting approximately 30 seconds, then repeated in the exact same pattern. William stood perfectly still, straining his ears to determine the source of the sound. His first thought was that another hunter was in the area, perhaps knocking on a tree trunk to communicate with a partner or to rouse game animals from cover. But the volume and resonance of the knock suggested something much more powerful than a human striking a tree with a stick or gun barrel. The sound carried a deep, hollow quality that reminded him of a massive drum being struck with tremendous force. The knocking pattern continued for several minutes, always maintaining the same rhythm and timing. William tried to triangulate the source by moving to different positions and noting how the sound changed, but the dense forest and mountainous terrain made it difficult to pinpoint an exact location. The sound seemed to come from a ravine that cut deep into the mountainside, an area William knew to be filled with almost impenetrable rhododendron thickets and steep rocky walls. As abruptly as it had begun, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed seemed even more oppressive than before, as if the entire forest was holding its breath in anticipation of what might happen next. William waited for several minutes, hoping the sound would resume and provide additional clues about its source, but the forest remained eerily quiet. Even the ever-present murmur of the creek seemed muted, as if the water itself was flowing more quietly than usual. Against his better judgment, William decided to investigate the source of the knocking. His Cherokee upbringing had taught him to respect the unknown aspects of the forest, but his curiosity as a hunter and his concern about what might be sharing his hunting area overcame his natural caution. He cached his hunting pack at the base of a distinctive, lightning-struck oak tree, taking only his rifle, a water bottle, and basic emergency supplies. If he encountered dangerous terrain or needed to move quickly, the reduced weight would allow him greater mobility. The route toward the source of the knocking led William through some of the most challenging terrain he had encountered in years of hunting these mountains. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen logs in various stages of decay, creating a treacherous surface where a single misstep could result in a serious fall. Massive rhododendron bushes formed nearly impenetrable thickets that forced him to crawl on hands and knees in some areas, the thick, leathery leaves blocking out most of the available light and creating a tunnel-like environment that was both claustrophobic and disorienting. As he worked his way deeper into the ravine, William began to notice additional signs that something unusual had been using this area regularly. Trees showed fresh bark damage at heights of 8 to 10 feet, with what appeared to be territorial markings scratched deep into the wood. The scratches were too high and too large to have been made by bears, and they showed a deliberate pattern that suggested intelligence rather than random damage. Some of the marks appeared to have been made recently, with fresh wood exposed and sap still oozing from the wounds. The smell in this part of the forest was also distinctly different from what William expected. Underneath the normal odors of decaying vegetation and mountain streams was a musky animal scent that he couldn't identify. It was similar to the smell of a bear den, but much stronger and with an almost human quality that made his skin crawl. The odor seemed to be concentrated in certain areas, suggesting that whatever produced it had specific locations where it spent considerable time. After nearly an hour of difficult travel through the ravine, William reached a natural clearing where a massive oak tree had fallen years earlier, creating an opening in the forest canopy that allowed sunlight to reach the ground. The fallen tree, easily 6 feet in diameter at its base, had crashed across the ravine and created a natural bridge between the steep walls. But what captured William's immediate attention wasn't the fallen tree itself, it was what had been done to it. The massive trunk showed clear evidence of having been deliberately modified by something with incredible strength. Large sections of bark had been stripped away in systematic patterns, revealing the pale wood underneath. Some of these stripped areas formed what appeared to be crude symbols or markings, though William couldn't determine if they represented any kind of language or were simply random destruction. More disturbing were the deep gouges carved into the wood itself, furrows that appeared to have been made by claws or fingernails far larger than any known animal possessed. Scattered around the fallen tree were the remains of several small animals, squirrels, chipmunks, and what appeared to be the remnants of a young deer. The bones had been broken open and the marrow extracted, indicating that whatever had killed these animals possessed both the knowledge and strength to access the nutritious interior of the bones. The kill sites showed no signs of being the work of known predators. There were no tooth marks consistent with bears, mountain lions, or other large carnivores that inhabited the region. As William examined the evidence around the fallen tree, he became aware that the oppressive silence he had noticed throughout the day was beginning to change. From somewhere deeper in the ravine came the sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Unlike the passage of deer or other common forest animals, this movement had a deliberate, heavy quality that suggested considerable size and weight. The sounds were irregular, sometimes stopping for long periods before resuming, as if whatever was making them was aware of William's presence and was moving cautiously. The sounds grew closer over the course of several minutes, and William found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The ravine offered limited escape routes, and the dense vegetation would make rapid movement extremely difficult. He checked his rifle again, ensuring that a round was chambered and the safety was off, though he had serious doubts about whether any weapon he carried would be effective against something capable of the destruction he had observed around the fallen tree. The movement sounds stopped when they were perhaps 50 yards away, close enough that William could occasionally hear the sound of heavy breathing echoing off the ravine walls. The breathing had an unusual rhythm, deeper and slower than that of any animal he recognized. Most unnerving was the way the breathing occasionally seemed to pause, as if whatever was producing it was listening intently to its surroundings, trying to locate and identify the source of William's scent or the small sounds he made, despite his efforts to remain perfectly still. For nearly 20 minutes, William and the unseen presence engaged in a tense standoff. He remained crouched behind the fallen oak, rifle ready, while something large and unknown waited in the dense vegetation just out of sight. The psychological pressure of the situation was intense. William found himself fighting the urge to flee or to call out, either of which would likely provoke a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. His Cherokee training helped him maintain calm, drawing on traditional techniques for remaining patient and alert during dangerous situations. The standoff ended when the knocking sound resumed, this time much closer and significantly louder than before. The source was clearly just on the other side of the fallen tree, perhaps 30 feet from William's position. Each knock resonated through the ravine like a gunshot, the sound so powerful that he could feel the vibrations through the ground. The pattern remained the same: 3 knocks separated by 3-second intervals, followed by 30 seconds of silence before repeating. But now William could see what was making the sound. Through a gap in the vegetation, he caught his first glimpse of something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. The creature was partially obscured by leaves and shadows, but what he could see was both fascinating and terrifying. It stood upright like a human, but was covered in dark, shaggy hair that appeared to be several inches long. Its shoulders were massive, broader than any human's, and its arms were disproportionately long, hanging down past where its knees would be. The creature was striking the fallen tree with what appeared to be a heavy branch, using both hands to deliver blows that would have required tremendous strength. Each impact sent vibrations through the massive trunk and created the resonant knocking sound that had first attracted William's attention. The rhythm and deliberate nature of the knocking suggested that this was some form of communication rather than random noise-making, though William couldn't begin to guess what message was being conveyed or to whom. As he watched in fascination and growing terror, the creature turned slightly in his direction, and William caught a glimpse of its face. The features were a disturbing combination of human and ape-like characteristics, a heavy brow ridge, deep-set eyes, and a broad, flat nose. But the intelligence in those eyes was unmistakably present, suggesting a level of awareness and cognitive ability that separated this creature from any known animal. When their eyes met for just an instant, William felt a jolt of recognition pass between them, an acknowledgement that they were both intelligent beings sharing a moment of mutual assessment. The creature stopped its knocking and stood perfectly still, apparently studying William with the same intensity that he was observing it. For several seconds, neither moved, each trying to determine the other's intentions and capabilities. William could see that the creature was even larger than he had initially estimated, probably close to 8 feet tall and possessing a physical build that suggested incredible strength. Its hands, which he could see clearly as it gripped the branch it had been using for knocking, were proportioned like human hands, but scaled up to match its massive size. The confrontation ended when the creature apparently decided that William posed no immediate threat. It dropped the branch it had been using and melted back into the dense vegetation with surprising grace for something so large. Within seconds, all evidence of its presence had vanished, except for the continued sound of heavy movement receding deeper into the ravine. The silence that followed was complete and profound, as if the forest itself was recovering from the shock of what had just occurred. William remained motionless for several more minutes, processing what he had witnessed and trying to determine his next course of action. Every instinct told him to leave the area immediately, to return to his camp, pack his gear, and hike out of the mountains as quickly as possible. But his rational mind struggled to accept what he had seen, searching for alternative explanations that would fit within his understanding of the natural world. Could it have been an escaped gorilla from a zoo or research facility? A person in an elaborate costume playing some kind of prank? Mental illness or hallucination brought on by isolation and stress? None of these explanations satisfied him. What he had seen moved with the fluid grace of a wild animal perfectly adapted to its environment, showing no sign of the awkwardness that would characterize either a zoo animal or a person in costume. The intelligence in its eyes had been real and unmistakable, as had the casual display of strength when it struck the fallen tree. Most convincing was the way it had simply vanished into the forest. No crashing through underbrush, no sounds of retreat, just a silent dissolution into the landscape that spoke of perfect adaptation to this environment. The hike back to his camp took William much longer than the trip into the ravine, partly because he was retracing a difficult route, but mostly because he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder and pausing to listen for sounds of pursuit. The creature had shown no signs of aggression during their encounter, but William had no way of knowing whether it might follow him or whether there might be others in the area. The tracks he had found that morning suddenly took on much greater significance, suggesting that what he had encountered was not an isolated individual, but possibly part of a population that had been living in these remote mountains for an unknown period of time. By the time William reached his camp, the sun was beginning to set and the temperature was dropping rapidly. He built up his fire larger than usual, both for warmth and for the psychological comfort of having light in what was shaping up to be a very long night. As he prepared his evening meal, his hands shook slightly, not from the cold, but from the adrenaline that was still coursing through his system hours after the encounter. He found himself jumping at every small sound, his nerves on edge, in a way that was completely foreign to someone who had spent countless nights alone in the wilderness. The normal evening chorus of forest sounds remained absent, just as it had been the previous night. But now William understood that this silence wasn't random. It was a response to the presence of something that the smaller animals instinctively feared and avoided. The creature he had encountered, and possibly others like it, were apex predators in this ecosystem, occupying a niche that placed them at the top of the food chain and made them masters of their territory. As full darkness settled over the valley, William heard the knocking sound again, but this time it came from multiple directions. The original three-knock pattern was answered by similar sounds from at least 2 other locations, creating a triangular communication network that seemed to surround his camp. The spacing between the knocking sites suggested that the creatures were coordinating their movements, possibly communicating about his presence in their territory or planning some kind of group activity. William loaded his rifle and placed extra ammunition within easy reach, though he harbored no illusions about his ability to defend himself against multiple creatures of the size and apparent intelligence he had encountered. His best hope for survival lay in remaining calm, avoiding any actions that might be interpreted as threatening, and waiting for daylight when he could attempt to leave the area. The thought of spending the entire night in his tent, surrounded by unknown creatures capable of incredible strength and operating with apparent coordination, was almost unbearable. The knocking continued throughout the night, sometimes distant, sometimes alarmingly close to his camp. The pattern evolved over time, becoming more complex and including variations in rhythm and intensity that suggested a sophisticated communication system. At times, the knocking was accompanied by other sounds, low-pitched vocalizations that seemed almost like distorted human speech, the crack of large branches being broken, and the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the forest with surprising stealth. Around midnight, one of the creatures approached William's camp directly. He could hear its movement as it circled his position, staying just outside the ring of light cast by his fire, but clearly observing him. The sound of its breathing was clearly audible, deep and steady, with occasional snorts or huffs that might have indicated curiosity or some form of emotional response. Most unnerving was the way it seemed to pause at certain points in its circuit, as if studying his equipment, his fire, or his tent from different angles. During one of these pauses, William caught a glimpse of the creature silhouetted against the stars. It was standing upright at the edge of his camp, motionless, apparently watching him through the walls of his tent. The silhouette confirmed his earlier observations about its size and proportions, massively built, with long arms and a distinctly human-like posture, despite its ape-like features. After several minutes of observation, the creature moved on, but William knew that others were still in the area, their presence marked by occasional sounds and the continuing knocking communications. Sleep was impossible under these conditions. William spent the night sitting up in his sleeping bag, rifle across his knees, feeding wood to his fire and listening to the sounds of the creatures moving through the forest around his camp. He tried to make sense of what was happening, to understand whether their behavior represented curiosity, territorial defense, or something more threatening. The fact that they hadn't approached closer or made any overtly aggressive moves suggested that they might simply be investigating the unusual presence in their territory. But William had no way of knowing how long their patience would last or what might trigger a more direct confrontation. Dawn came as a relief, bringing with it the return of some normal forest sounds and the retreat of the creatures to whatever areas they used for daytime shelter. The knocking communications ceased with the first light, and the oppressive sense of being watched gradually faded as the sun climbed higher in the sky. William emerged from his tent, feeling exhausted and emotionally drained, but grateful to have survived the night without a direct confrontation. His original plan had been to spend one more day hunting in the valley before hiking out, but the events of the past 24 hours had completely changed his priorities. His only goal now was to leave the area as quickly and safely as possible, putting as much distance between himself and the creatures as he could manage. The thought of spending another night in their territory was unacceptable. Whatever these beings were, they had made it clear that this was their domain, and that his presence was barely tolerated. William packed his gear with unusual haste, abandoning his normal methodical approach in favor of speed. He cached some of his heavier, less essential equipment near his campsite, planning to retrieve it on a future trip if he ever felt safe enough to return to this area. The rifle, ammunition, food, water, and basic survival gear went into his pack, along with the small digital camera he had brought to document any interesting wildlife he might encounter. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had indeed encountered the most remarkable wildlife of his career, but under circumstances that made photography impossible. As he prepared to leave Whispering Creek Hollow, William took one last look around the valley that had been a favorite hunting destination for decades. Despite the terror of the past night, there was a part of him that felt privileged to have witnessed something that challenged the boundaries of known science. How many people had ever seen creatures like these in their natural habitat? how many had lived to tell about it. The rational part of his mind was already beginning to question his own perceptions, suggesting that stress, isolation, and imagination might have played tricks on him. But the physical evidence was undeniable. The footprints were real, pressed deep into the earth by something of immense weight and size. The territorial markings on the trees were real, carved deep into living wood by claws or fingernails far larger than any known animal possessed. The sounds were real. The knocking, the vocalizations, the heavy breathing that had surrounded his camp throughout the night. Whatever these creatures were, they were not products of his imagination or hallucinations brought on by stress. The hike out of the valley took William most of the day, though he pushed himself harder than usual in his eagerness to reach his truck and the relative safety of the modern world. Several times during the descent, he heard sounds behind him that suggested he might be followed. The crack of branches, the rustle of vegetation, the occasional sound of something large moving parallel to his route. But whenever he stopped to look back, he saw nothing, leading him to wonder if the creatures were deliberately staying hidden while monitoring his departure from their territory. By late afternoon, William reached the Forest Service road where he had parked his truck. The sight of the familiar blue Ford pickup was enormously reassuring, representing a connection to the world of technology and human civilization that felt much more solid and predictable than the primeval forest he was leaving behind. As he loaded his gear into the truck bed, he noticed that his hands were still shaking slightly, a reminder of the adrenaline and stress that had been his constant companions for the past 2 days. The drive down the mountain to the small town of Bryson City gave William time to begin processing what he had experienced and to consider what he should do with the knowledge he now possessed. His first instinct was to report what he had seen to the appropriate authorities, perhaps the Park Service, the State Wildlife Commission, or even academic researchers who might be interested in investigating his claims. But he also knew how such reports were typically received, the skepticism and ridicule that typically greeted accounts of unknown creatures in the woods. His Cherokee heritage included numerous stories of similar creatures, beings that walked upright through the deepest forests but were not quite human or animal. These stories had been passed down through generations, often dismissed by modern scholars as folklore or superstition. But William now wondered if these traditional accounts might actually represent accurate observations passed down through oral tradition, eyewitness accounts of real creatures that had learned to avoid human contact as the forests shrank and civilization encroached on their habitat. The town of Bryson City felt surreal after his experience in the mountains. The normal activities of human civilization, cars driving down paved streets, people shopping in stores, children playing in yards, seemed almost alien compared to the primitive world he had just left. The contrast was jarring, highlighting how removed most people were from the wild places where unknown things might still exist beyond the reach of scientific cataloging and human understanding. William checked into a small motel room and spent several hours reviewing the digital photos he had taken during his trip, hoping to find some image that might document what he had seen. But the encounter with the creature had happened too quickly and under too stressful circumstances for him to think about photography. The images on his camera showed only the normal scenery of his hunting trip, mountain vistas, forest trails, and his campsite, with no evidence of the extraordinary events that had unfolded. That evening, William called his oldest friend, James Crow Feather, a Cherokee elder who had grown up hearing the same traditional stories about forest creatures that had been part of William's childhood. James listened without interruption as William recounted his experience, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details, but never expressing skepticism or disbelief. When William finished his account, James was quiet for several minutes before responding. "My grandfather told me stories about such creatures," James said finally. He called them the Old Ones, beings who had lived in these mountains since before the Cherokee came to this land. According to the old stories, they were here when our people first arrived, and there was an understanding between us. We would share the forest, but each would respect the other's territory and way of life. James went on to explain that the traditional Cherokee understanding was that these creatures possessed intelligence similar to humans, but had chosen to live apart from human society, maintaining their connection to the natural world rather than adopting the tools and lifestyle of civilization. They were neither animals nor humans in the conventional sense, but something in between, beings who bridged the gap between the natural and supernatural worlds. The old people said that encounters with them were rare and that they usually occurred when someone had wandered into their most sacred places or when some kind of balance had been disturbed. James continued. They were not considered evil or dangerous, but they demanded respect and caution. The stories always emphasized that these beings were far stronger than humans and possessed knowledge of the forest that we could never match. William found James's words both comforting and troubling. Comforting because they provided a cultural context for his experience, suggesting that what he had encountered was part of a long tradition of interaction between Cherokee people and these mysterious beings. Troubling because they implied that his encounter might not have been a random event, but rather something that carried deeper significance, perhaps indicating changes in the mountain ecosystem or disturbances that had upset long-standing territorial boundaries. Over the following weeks, William found himself unable to return to his normal routine. The experience in Whispering Creek Hollow had fundamentally changed his relationship with the forest and his understanding of what might be possible in the remote wilderness areas that still existed in the modern world. He continued to hunt, but only in areas where he felt confident that he was unlikely to encounter the creatures again. The thought of another confrontation filled him with anxiety that interfered with his ability to focus on normal hunting activities. Word of William's experience gradually spread through the local Cherokee community, despite his initial reluctance to discuss it widely. The story resonated with other tribal members who had heard similar accounts from relatives or who had experienced their own unexplained encounters in the mountains. Several elderly Cherokee shared stories that had been passed down through their families, accounts that paralleled William's experience in remarkable detail. One particularly significant conversation occurred with Mary Swimmer, a Cherokee woman in her 80s who had grown up in a remote mountain community before the area was incorporated into the national forest. Mary revealed that her family had maintained specific protocols for traveling through certain areas of the mountains, routes and behaviors designed to avoid conflict with what she called the hairy people, who lived in the deepest valleys and most inaccessible ridges. "We always knew they were there," Mary explained during one of William's visits to her home. "My grandmother taught me to recognize the signs of their presence, the silence in the forest, the way the smaller animals would behave when they were near, the territorial markings they would leave on trees. We had ways of letting them know we were passing through their area peacefully, and they would usually avoid contact with us." Mary's account included details about the creature's behavior that closely matched William's observations. She described their use of knocking sounds for communication, their tremendous strength and size, and their apparent intelligence and ability to coordinate group activities. Most importantly, she confirmed that encounters like William's had historically occurred when humans ventured into areas that the creatures considered their exclusive territory, particularly during certain times of year when they might be engaged in activities related to mating, food gathering, or territorial defense. The more William learned about the traditional Cherokee knowledge of these creatures, the more he realized that his encounter had been far from unique. What was unusual was not the existence of the creatures themselves, but rather the fact that modern people had largely forgotten about them or dismissed the old stories as superstition. The expansion of human development and recreational use of the forests had apparently pushed the creatures deeper into the most remote areas, making encounters increasingly rare but not eliminating them entirely. This realization led William to begin thinking about the implications of his experience beyond his own personal fear and confusion. If these creatures were real, and all evidence suggested they were, then they represented a species or subspecies that had successfully avoided scientific documentation for centuries. They were intelligent enough to evade human detection, strong enough to survive in harsh mountain environments, and organized enough to maintain territorial boundaries and communication systems that rivaled those of any known animal species. The question that haunted William was whether he had a responsibility to report his encounter to scientists or government agencies who might be interested in studying these creatures. On one hand, the scientific community would undoubtedly be fascinated by evidence of an unknown hominid species surviving in North American forests. Such a discovery would revolutionize understanding of primate evolution, human prehistory, and the limits of wildlife adaptation. On the other hand, scientific study would inevitably lead to increased human intrusion into the creature's habitat, potentially disrupting whatever delicate balance had allowed them to survive undetected for so long. The Cherokee cultural perspective that James and Mary had shared emphasized the importance of respecting the creature's choice to remain hidden and avoiding actions that might interfere with their way of life. This traditional viewpoint suggested that William's encounter should be understood as a warning or reminder about the importance of respecting territorial boundaries rather than as an opportunity for scientific exploitation. The creatures had allowed him to leave their territory unharmed, which could be interpreted as a gesture of tolerance that should be honored rather than violated. Months passed before William felt ready to return to hunting in the mountains, and when he did resume his activities, he made significant changes to his approach. He studied the traditional Cherokee knowledge that James and Mary had shared with him, learning to recognize the signs that indicated when he might be entering territory claimed by the creatures. He developed new protocols for wilderness camping that emphasized respect for the forest and its inhabitants, incorporating elements of traditional Cherokee practice that were designed to demonstrate peaceful intentions to any beings who might be observing him. Most importantly, William began sharing his experience with other hunters and outdoor enthusiasts, not as a sensational story designed to frighten or entertain, but as a cautionary account that emphasized the importance of approaching the wilderness with proper respect and humility. He focused on the practical aspects of his encounter, the signs that had warned him of the creature's presence, the behavioral patterns he had observed, and the protocols that had apparently allowed him to leave their territory safely. The response to William's accounts was mixed. Some listeners dismissed his story as imagination or exaggeration, unwilling to consider the possibility that unknown creatures might still exist in the modern world. Others were intrigued by the details and authenticity of his account, particularly those who had spent significant time in remote wilderness areas and had experienced their own unexplained encounters or observations. A few individuals privately shared their own similar experiences, suggesting that encounters with these creatures might be more common than generally acknowledged, but were rarely reported due to fear of ridicule or disbelief. One particularly significant response came from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a primatologist at the University of North Carolina who had studied ape behavior in both laboratory and field settings. Dr. Mitchell contacted William after hearing about his experience through mutual friends, expressing scientific interest in the behavioral details he had observed. Unlike many academics, she approached the subject with an open mind, acknowledging that the existence of unknown primate species remained a possibility despite the skepticism of mainstream science. Dr. Mitchell's analysis of William's account focused on the intelligence and coordination the creatures had displayed during their encounter. The use of knocking for long-distance communication, the apparent territorial marking behavior, and the coordinated surveillance of his camp all suggested cognitive abilities that would place these creatures well above any known ape species in terms of intelligence. If William's observations were accurate, these beings might possess problem-solving abilities and social organization that approached or even exceeded those of early human populations. The conversation with Dr. Mitchell reinforced William's growing sense that his encounter had been with something truly extraordinary, beings who represented either an unknown species or a population that had diverged from known primates through centuries of isolation and adaptation to specific environmental conditions. The implications for understanding human evolution and the development of intelligence were staggering, but so were the ethical questions about whether such beings had the right to remain undisturbed in their chosen habitat. Years passed before William finally made peace with his experience and its implications. He never returned to hunt in Whispering Creek Hollow, though he occasionally hiked to the edges of the valley to leave tobacco offerings in accordance with Cherokee tradition. These visits were his way of acknowledging the creatures' sovereignty over their territory and expressing gratitude for their decision to allow him to leave unharmed. Sometimes he thought he could sense their presence during these visits, though he never again saw them directly. The story of William's encounter eventually became part of local Cherokee oral tradition, joining the centuries-old accounts of similar beings that had always been part of the tribe's relationship with the mountain forests. Young Cherokee hunters learned about the signs that indicated the presence of these creatures and the protocols that should be followed if an encounter occurred. The knowledge was passed down not as superstition or folklore, but as practical wisdom about sharing the forest with all of its inhabitants, including those who preferred to remain hidden from human awareness. William's experience also influenced his relationship with hunting and the outdoors in general. He became more selective about the areas where he hunted, avoiding the deepest and most remote locations where he might inadvertently intrude on the creature's territory. When he did hunt, he incorporated traditional Cherokee practices that emphasized respect for the forest and its inhabitants, treating his activities as sacred interactions with the natural world rather than mere recreational pursuits. The transformation in William's worldview extended beyond hunting to encompass his entire understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. His encounter had demonstrated that despite centuries of scientific study and technological advancement, there were still mysteries in the world that defied easy explanation or classification. The creatures he had encountered represented a reminder that humans were not the only intelligent inhabitants of the planet, and that wisdom sometimes required acknowledging the limits of human knowledge and control. In his later years, William became something of an elder himself within the Cherokee community, sharing not only his account of the encounter, but also the traditional knowledge and wisdom that had helped him understand and process the experience. He emphasized that the creatures should be approached with the same respect that Cherokee tradition accorded to all aspects of the natural world, as beings with their own rights, territories, and ways of life that deserved protection rather than exploitation. The last conversation William had about his encounter was with his grandson, Michael Two Moons, who was preparing for his first solo hunting trip into the mountains. As they sat around the fire on the evening before Michael's departure, William shared the full account of what had happened in Whispering Creek Hollow, including the traditional Cherokee context that had helped him understand the experience. The most important thing to remember, William told his grandson, is that we are visitors in their world, not the other way around. If you ever encounter signs of their presence, treat them with the same respect you would show to any powerful and intelligent being. They have chosen to remain hidden from our world, and that choice should be honored. Michael listened with the serious attention that Cherokee youth traditionally showed when receiving important knowledge from their elders. He asked practical questions about recognizing signs of the creature's presence and about the protocols his grandfather had developed for avoiding unwanted encounters. But he also asked deeper questions about what the existence of such beings meant for understanding the world and humanity's place within it. They remind us that there are still mysteries in the world, William replied, and that sometimes the most important knowledge comes not from studying and cataloging everything we encounter, but from learning to live respectfully alongside beings and forces that we may never fully understand. That's a lesson our ancestors understood, and it's one that the modern world has largely forgotten. As Michael prepared to leave for his hunting trip the next morning, William offered him a small medicine bundle that contained tobacco, sage, and cedar, traditional offerings that could be used to show respect if he encountered anything unusual in the forest. The bundle also contained a small piece of bone that had been passed down through their family for generations, a remnant from an animal that had been taken according to proper protocols and had provided sustenance during a difficult winter long ago. "Remember that hunting is a sacred activity," William said as he handed his grandson the medicine bundle. "It connects us to the land, to our ancestors, and to all the beings who share the forest with us. If you approach it with the proper respect and humility, the forest will teach you things that no book or classroom ever could. And if you're very fortunate, or perhaps very unfortunate, you might encounter something that reminds you how much we still don't know about the world around us." Michael's hunting trip passed without any unusual incidents, but he returned with a deeper appreciation for the traditional knowledge his grandfather had shared, and a heightened awareness of the signs and sounds that revealed the forest's hidden life. Over the years that followed, he would occasionally experience moments in the deep woods when the forest would fall into the kind of profound silence that his grandfather had described, and he would remember the lessons about respect and humility that had been passed down through generations of Cherokee hunters. The story of William Two Moon's encounter with the unknown creatures of Whispering Creek Hollow became part of the ongoing tradition of Cherokee knowledge about the natural world and humanity's place within it. It served as a reminder that despite all of human civilization's technological achievements and scientific discoveries, there were still aspects of the natural world that remained beyond human understanding or control. And sometimes, perhaps, that was exactly as it should be. In the end, William's encounter had taught him that the most profound mysteries of life were not problems to be solved, but realities to be acknowledged and respected. The creatures he had encountered in that remote mountain valley represented something that transcended the boundaries between the known and unknown, between the natural and supernatural, between the human and non-human worlds. They were a reminder that the earth still held secrets, and that wisdom sometimes meant being content to let those secrets remain hidden in the shadows of the deep forest, protected by silence and guarded by respect for the unknown. The next case. The morning mist clung to the Wasatch Mountains like a shroud, filtering the early September sunlight into diffused beams that painted the forest floor in shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Brandon Hughes adjusted the straps of his hiking pack, feeling the familiar weight of his geological survey equipment settle against his shoulders. At 34, he had spent the better part of a decade exploring the remote wilderness areas of Utah, documenting mineral deposits and geological formations for the state's Department of Natural Resources. This assignment in the Uinta Wasatch Cache National Forest was routine, or so he believed. Brandon's credentials were impeccable. He held a master's degree in geology from the University of Utah, with a specialization in structural geology and field mapping. His dissertation on the geological history of the Wasatch Fault had earned him recognition in academic circles, and his subsequent work with the state had taken him into some of the most isolated and challenging terrain in the American West. He was comfortable in the wilderness, skilled in survival techniques, and possessed an analytical mind that approached problems with scientific rigor and methodical precision. Standing at 6 feet 2 inches with a lean, muscular build honed by years of hiking and rock climbing, Brandon cut an imposing figure against the alpine landscape. His dark brown hair was cropped short beneath a well-worn baseball cap, and his hazel eyes held the steady gaze of someone accustomed to observing the world with careful attention to detail. A neatly trimmed beard covered his angular jaw, and his hands bore the calluses and small scars that came from years of handling rock samples and field equipment. The assignment that brought him to this particular section of the forest was straightforward. Conduct a geological survey of a previously unmapped area approximately 15 miles northeast of Mirror Lake, documenting rock formations, mineral deposits, and any geological features that might be of scientific or economic interest. The area was remote enough that it required a multi-day expedition, and Brandon had planned for a 5-day solo survey that would take him deep into terrain that saw few human visitors. His equipment was comprehensive and carefully chosen. The pack contained a GPS unit, topographic maps sealed in waterproof cases, a rock hammer, sample bags, a magnifying glass, a portable scale, pH testing strips, a camera with extra batteries and memory cards, a notebook in a protective case, and detailed data sheets for recording his observations. His camping gear included a lightweight but durable tent, a sleeping bag rated for mountain conditions, a portable stove with fuel, water purification tablets, and enough food for 7 days, 2 extra days as a safety margin. Brandon had also brought along his companion of 3 years, a German shepherd mix named Scout. The dog was exceptionally well trained, having accompanied Brandon on numerous wilderness expeditions. Scout possessed an uncanny ability to detect wildlife at great distances, and his presence had proven invaluable on previous trips, both as an early warning system and as companionship during long nights in the wilderness. At 75 pounds of muscle and intelligence, Scout was perfectly adapted to mountain travel, with thick fur that provided protection against cold and rough terrain, and stamina that easily matched Brandon's own. The relationship between Brandon and Scout was one of mutual respect and deep understanding. The dog seemed to anticipate his master's needs, whether it was alerting him to approaching weather changes or simply providing comfort during the loneliness that sometimes accompanied extended solo expeditions. Scout's presence had become so integral to Brandon's work that he couldn't imagine conducting a field survey without him. The drive to the trailhead had taken most of the previous day, with Brandon navigating increasingly narrow and rough Forest Service roads until he reached the designated parking area at the end of Forest Service Road 217. The elevation at the trailhead was approximately 8,200 feet, and the terrain ahead would take him up to nearly 10,000 feet before dropping down into the remote valley that was his ultimate destination. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures for the first 3 days, with a possible cold front moving in later in the week. As Brandon began his hike into the wilderness, he reflected on the geological significance of the area he was entering. The Uinta Mountains represented one of the few major mountain ranges in the lower 48 states that ran east-west rather than north-south, a geological anomaly that had fascinated scientists for decades. The range was composed primarily of Precambrian quartzite and sandstone, some of the oldest rock formations in North America, dating back over 1 billion years. The area he was surveying lay within a complex zone where these ancient rocks had been uplifted, folded and fractured by tectonic forces, creating a landscape of dramatic beauty and geological complexity. The trail initially followed a well-established path used by backpackers and hunters, but after 3 miles, Brandon would need to leave the maintained trail and strike out cross-country toward his survey area. The terrain was challenging, but not dangerous for someone with his experience, consisting of dense forest interspersed with open meadows, rocky outcrops, and steep-sided valleys carved by ancient glacial action. The first day of hiking proceeded exactly as planned. Brandon made good time along the maintained trail, covering the initial 3 miles in just over an hour, despite the elevation gain. Scout ranged ahead and behind, investigating interesting scents and sounds, but always returning to check in with his master. The dog's behavior was relaxed and alert, showing none of the tension that Brandon had learned to recognize as a sign of potential danger. When they reached the point where Brandon needed to leave the trail, he stopped for a brief rest and consulted his topographic maps. The survey area lay in a valley approximately 4 miles to the northeast, accessible by following a series of ridgelines and then descending through a gap in the mountains. The route would take them through several distinct ecological zones, from the dense pine and fir forests of the lower elevations to the alpine meadows and exposed rock formations near the tree line. The off-trail portion of the hike required careful navigation and constant attention to the terrain. Brandon used his GPS unit to track their progress, but he also relied on traditional navigation techniques, using compass bearings and landmark identification to ensure they stayed on course. The forest was thick in places, requiring them to push through dense undergrowth and navigate around fallen trees and rocky obstacles. As they climbed higher, the forest began to change character. The dense, lower elevation woods of Douglas fir and ponderosa pine gave way to Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, trees adapted to the harsher conditions found at higher elevations. The undergrowth became sparser, and the forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of pine needles that muffled their footsteps. Brandon paused frequently to examine rock outcrops and geological features, taking photographs and making notes in his field notebook. The exposed rock formations showed clear evidence of the complex geological history of the region, with layers of sedimentary rock that had been tilted, folded, and fractured by millions of years of tectonic activity. In several places, he found examples of the ancient quartzite that formed the backbone of the Uinta Mountains, its crystalline structure glinting in the filtered sunlight. The first night's campsite was chosen with care, in a small clearing surrounded by mature spruce trees that provided both shelter and concealment. Brandon set up his tent on level ground, ensuring good drainage in case of rain, and positioned it so that the morning sun would warm the tent without being too intense. Scout helped by investigating the perimeter of the campsite, his behavior remaining relaxed and confident. The evening routine was practiced and efficient. Brandon prepared a simple but nutritious dinner on his portable stove, sharing portions with Scout, who had his own supply of high-energy dog food supplemented with treats. As darkness fell, Brandon reviewed his notes from the day and planned the next day's route using his maps and GPS unit. The silence of the wilderness was profound, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the distant sound of wind in the trees. Brandon had always found these quiet moments in the wilderness to be among the most peaceful and restorative of his life. The stress and noise of modern civilization seemed to melt away, replaced by a deep sense of connection to the natural world and an appreciation for the vast scales of geological time that his work helped him understand. Scout lay beside the tent, alert but relaxed, occasionally lifting his head to sample the night air for interesting scents. The first night passed without incident. Brandon slept well in his familiar sleeping bag, warm and comfortable despite the cool mountain air. Scout spent the night outside the tent, as was his preference, but remained close by. The dog's senses were far more acute than Brandon's, and his presence provided an additional layer of security in the wilderness. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, announced first by a gradual lightening of the sky visible through the trees, followed by the first rays of direct sunlight striking the higher peaks. Brandon was awake early, as was his custom, and began the morning routine of breaking camp and preparing for another day of hiking and surveying. The second day's hike took them across a series of ridgelines that offered spectacular views of the surrounding mountains and valleys. The terrain was more challenging than the previous day, with steep climbs and descents that required careful attention to footing and balance. Brandon's geological training allowed him to read the landscape like a book, identifying the processes that had shaped the mountains over millions of years, and predicting the types of rock formations they were likely to encounter. As they climbed toward a prominent ridgeline, Brandon noticed changes in the vegetation that indicated they were approaching the tree line. The trees became smaller and more widely spaced, adapted to the harsh conditions of high altitude, where the growing season was short and the weather could be extreme. In the more exposed areas, they encountered patches of alpine tundra, where low-growing plants clung to life in the thin soil and harsh climate. The views from the ridgeline were breathtaking. To the north, Brandon could see the distinctive profile of Kings Peak, Utah's highest mountain at 13,528 feet. To the south, the landscape dropped away into a series of deep valleys and canyons that eventually led back towards civilization. But it was the view to the east that captured his attention, revealing the remote valley that was his ultimate destination. The valley appeared to be completely untouched by human activity, a pristine wilderness of forest, meadows, and rocky outcrops that looked exactly as it had for thousands of years. A small stream wound through the valley floor, its course marked by a narrow line of deciduous trees that showed the first hints of fall color. The geological formations visible from the ridgeline suggested that the valley would be rich in scientific interest, with exposed rock faces and complex structures that would provide valuable data for his survey. The descent into the valley required careful route finding and considerable physical effort. The slope was steep and covered with loose rock and scree that made every step potentially hazardous. Brandon used trekking poles to maintain his balance and tested each foothold carefully before committing his full weight. Scout navigated the descent with the natural agility of his wild ancestors, but even he proceeded with unusual caution. As they dropped into the valley, the forest closed around them again, but the character of the woods was different from what they had encountered at lower elevations. The trees were older and larger, suggesting that this area had been undisturbed for many decades or possibly centuries. Some of the spruces and firs reached heights of over 100 feet, their massive trunks requiring several people to reach around their circumference. The forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of organic matter, fallen logs, pine needles, and decomposing vegetation that created a soft, spongy surface underfoot. The air was rich with the scent of pine and the earthy smell of forest decay, a complex mixture of fragrances that spoke of the continuous cycle of growth, death, and renewal that characterized healthy forest ecosystems. Brandon chose a campsite near the stream, on a small rise that provided good drainage and a clear view of the surrounding area. The sound of running water added a pleasant background to the profound silence of the wilderness, and the availability of fresh water would simplify their camping logistics. Scout immediately began investigating the area around the campsite, his behavior still relaxed and confident. The afternoon was spent conducting preliminary surveys of the immediate area. Brandon hiked upstream and downstream from the campsite, examining rock formations, taking photographs, and collecting samples of interesting minerals and rock types. The geological complexity of the valley was immediately apparent, with evidence of multiple periods of volcanic activity, sedimentary deposition, and tectonic deformation. In one area upstream from the campsite, Brandon discovered an exposed face of rock that showed clear evidence of mineral veins running through the ancient quartzite. The veins appeared to contain quartz and possibly other valuable minerals, and he spent considerable time photographing and documenting the formation. This was exactly the type of discovery that made his work rewarding, the identification of geological features that might have scientific or economic significance. As evening approached, Brandon returned to the campsite to prepare dinner and plan the next day's activities. The weather remained clear and mild, and the forecast suggested that conditions would remain favorable for at least 2 more days. Scout had spent the afternoon exploring the area around the campsite, and his behavior continued to indicate that all was normal in their wilderness environment. The second night passed as peacefully as the first. Brandon slept deeply, tired from the physical exertion of the descent into the valley and satisfied with the progress of his survey. Scout maintained his usual vigil outside the tent, occasionally changing position, but showing no signs of concern or alertness beyond his normal awareness of his surroundings. The third day dawned clear and cool, with a layer of frost covering the meadow near their campsite. Brandon emerged from his tent to find Scout sitting alert and attentive, looking downstream toward the lower end of the valley. The dog's posture was not one of alarm, but rather of intense interest in something that had captured his attention. When Brandon called to him, Scout came immediately, but continued to glance back toward whatever had caught his interest. After breakfast, Brandon decided to explore the lower portion of the valley, partly to investigate the geological formations he could see from the campsite, and partly to determine what had attracted Scout's attention. They set out downstream, following the course of the creek through increasingly dense forest. The trees in this part of the valley were even larger and older than those near the campsite, suggesting that this area had been completely untouched by human activity for many decades. The geological formations in the lower valley proved to be even more interesting than those Brandon had discovered upstream. In several places, the creek had cut deep channels through the bedrock, exposing complex structures and mineral deposits that would require detailed documentation. Brandon spent the morning photographing and mapping these formations, taking careful notes on their composition and structure. It was while he was examining a particularly interesting outcrop of mineralized quartzite that Brandon first noticed something unusual. Scout, who had been exploring nearby, suddenly froze in position, his head raised and his body tense with alertness. The dog's ears were pricked forward, and his entire posture indicated that he had detected something that demanded his full attention. Brandon looked up from his work and followed Scout's gaze, but initially saw nothing unusual. The forest around them appeared exactly as it had all morning, dense, quiet, and seemingly empty of wildlife. But Scout's behavior was unmistakable. The dog had detected something that concerned him, even if Brandon couldn't immediately identify what it was. Moving closer to Scout, Brandon spoke in a low voice, trying to determine what had triggered the dog's alertness. Scout remained frozen in position, his nose working as he analyzed scents carried on the barely perceptible breeze. After several minutes, the dog relaxed slightly, but remained more alert than he had been during the previous days of their expedition. Brandon resumed his geological work, but with heightened awareness of his surroundings. Scout's senses were far more acute than his own, and the dog's behavior served as an early warning system that had proven valuable on previous wilderness expeditions. While Scout had never led him astray, Brandon couldn't identify any obvious source of danger or concern in their immediate environment. The morning's work proceeded without further incident, but Brandon noticed that Scout remained more alert and attentive than usual. The dog continued to investigate interesting scents and sounds. but his behavior lacked the relaxed confidence that had characterized the first 2 days of their expedition. It was a subtle change, but one that Brandon recognized as significant. As they prepared to return to their campsite for lunch, Brandon took a final look around the area where Scout had first shown signs of alertness. The forest appeared unchanged, dense, quiet, and seemingly empty of anything that might pose a threat. But as his gaze swept across the terrain, something caught his attention that he hadn't noticed before. On the far side of the creek, partially hidden by a cluster of young spruce trees, was what appeared to be a tree that had been broken off about 8 feet from the ground. The break was clean and horizontal, not the jagged, splintered break that would be expected from storm damage or natural causes. The broken tree was a mature aspen with a trunk diameter of at least 8 inches, far too large to be broken by wind or the weight of snow. Brandon studied the broken tree from a distance, trying to determine what might have caused such damage. Lightning could break a tree in this manner, but there was no evidence of burning or the characteristic spiral damage pattern that lightning typically produced. The break appeared to be the result of tremendous force applied horizontally to the trunk, but Brandon couldn't imagine what natural process could have generated such force. Moving closer to investigate, Brandon had to cross the creek on a fallen log that formed a natural bridge. Scout followed reluctantly, his behavior indicating continued unease about something in their environment. The broken tree was even more puzzling when examined up close. The break was remarkably clean, almost as if the tree had been cut rather than broken, but there were no tool marks or other evidence of human activity. Even more puzzling was the absence of the upper portion of the tree. If the aspen had been broken by wind or some other natural force, the broken top should have fallen nearby. But Brandon could find no trace of it, despite a thorough search of the surrounding area. The missing portion of the tree appeared to have simply vanished, leaving only the 8-foot stump standing like a monument to some unknown force. Brandon photographed the broken tree from multiple angles and made detailed notes about its condition and location. As a scientist, he was trained to document unusual phenomena, even when he couldn't immediately explain them. The broken aspen was certainly unusual, but it was only a single data point, not necessarily indicative of anything more significant than an isolated natural event. As they prepared to return to their campsite, Scout's behavior became even more pronounced. The dog moved closer to Brandon's side and showed obvious reluctance to venture far from his master. His ears were constantly alert, and he frequently stopped to sample the air for scents that might explain his unease. Despite Brandon's encouragement, Scout refused to investigate the interesting scents and sounds that would normally have captured his attention. The return to their campsite was accomplished without incident, but Brandon found himself paying much closer attention to his surroundings than he had during the previous days. Scout's behavior was a clear indication that something in their environment had changed, even if Brandon couldn't identify what that something might be. The broken tree added another element of mystery to the situation, but a single damaged tree was hardly evidence of immediate danger. Lunch was a quiet affair, with Brandon reviewing his notes from the morning's geological work while Scout remained vigilant nearby. The dog accepted his food, but ate without his usual enthusiasm, and he continued to show signs of unease that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Brandon's scientific training encouraged him to look for rational explanations, but he was also experienced enough in wilderness travel to pay attention to subtle warning signs. The afternoon was scheduled for exploration of the upper portion of the valley, an area that appeared from a distance to contain interesting geological formations and possibly evidence of past volcanic activity. The terrain in that direction was more open, with fewer trees and better visibility, which might provide an opportunity to observe their surroundings more comprehensively. As they set out upstream from their campsite, Brandon noticed that Scout's reluctance to leave the immediate area of their camp had intensified. The dog followed obediently, but his body language clearly indicated that he would prefer to remain in the relative security of familiar territory. This was highly unusual behavior for Scout, who typically showed great enthusiasm for exploring new areas and investigating interesting scents and sounds. The upper valley proved to be geologically fascinating, with exposed rock formations that clearly showed the complex history of volcanic and tectonic activity in the region. Brandon spent considerable time documenting mineral veins and unusual rock structures, taking numerous photographs and collecting samples for later analysis. But throughout the afternoon, he remained acutely aware of Scout's continued unease and his own growing sense that they were not alone in the wilderness. It was late in the afternoon, as shadows began to lengthen across the valley floor, that Brandon made his next disturbing discovery. While photographing a mineral vein in an exposed rock face, he noticed what appeared to be unusual marks in the soft earth at the base of the formation. Moving closer to investigate, he realized that he was looking at tracks, footprints unlike anything he had ever seen before. The tracks were enormous, easily twice the size of Brandon's own size 11 hiking boots. They appeared to be made by a bipedal creature, with clear impressions of toes and what might have been the ball and heel of a foot. But the proportions were all wrong for any known animal, and the depth of the impressions suggested a creature of tremendous weight and size. Brandon knelt beside the tracks, studying them with the careful attention to detail that characterized his scientific training. The prints were remarkably clear, pressed into soft soil that had apparently been moistened by recent rain or morning dew. The stride length between individual prints was approximately 5 feet, again suggesting a creature much larger than any known animal in the region. Using a measuring tape from his geological equipment, Brandon carefully documented the size and spacing of the tracks. The individual footprints were approximately 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at their widest point. The depth of the impressions varied from 2 to 3 inches, indicating a creature that weighed several hundred pounds at minimum. Most disturbing of all, the tracks appeared to be relatively fresh, possibly made within the last day or two. Brandon photographed the tracks from multiple angles, using his hiking boot for scale in several shots. He also made detailed sketches in his field notebook, recording measurements and observations about the shape and characteristics of the individual prints. As a scientist, he was trained to document evidence objectively, regardless of how unusual or seemingly impossible it might appear. Scout's behavior during the track investigation was perhaps the most telling evidence of all. The dog refused to approach the footprints, remaining at a distance of several yards and showing clear signs of fear and agitation. His hackles were raised, and he emitted low, nervous whines that Brandon had rarely heard before. When Brandon called him closer to examine the tracks, Scout approached reluctantly and briefly, then quickly retreated to a safe distance. The discovery of the tracks forced Brandon to confront the possibility that their wilderness expedition had taken a decidedly unusual turn. As a scientist and a rational person, he looked for conventional explanations for what he was observing. Could the tracks have been made by a bear walking on its hind legs? The size and bipedal nature of the prints made this explanation highly unlikely. Could they be hoax tracks created by other humans? The remote location and pristine condition of the wilderness made this possibility equally unlikely. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, Brandon found himself faced with evidence that challenged his understanding of the natural world. The broken tree could potentially be explained by some unusual natural phenomenon, but the tracks represented something far more difficult to rationalize. The combination of the two discoveries, along with Scout's obvious unease, created a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The return to their campsite as daylight began to fade was accomplished with much greater caution than their earlier movements through the valley. Brandon found himself constantly scanning the forest around them, looking for any sign of the creature that might have made the enormous tracks. Scout remained close to his side, his alertness now approaching a state of constant vigilance that was both reassuring and deeply concerning. Back at their campsite, Brandon spent the evening reviewing the photographs and notes from his disturbing discoveries. The images of the tracks were clear and detailed, showing unmistakably the evidence of some large, bipedal creature moving through their valley. The measurements and documentation would satisfy any scientific standard for recording unusual phenomena, but Brandon was beginning to understand that scientific standards might not be adequate for dealing with whatever they had encountered. The third night was unlike the previous two. Brandon found it difficult to sleep, partly due to his own heightened awareness and partly due to Scout's obvious agitation. The dog refused to settle into his usual sleeping position outside the tent, instead remaining alert and watchful throughout the night. Several times, Brandon was awakened by Scout's low growls, but investigation revealed nothing visible that might have triggered the dog's response. During one period of wakefulness in the early morning hours, Brandon thought he heard sounds in the forest that didn't belong to the normal nighttime symphony of wind and wildlife. The sounds were difficult to identify, perhaps heavy footsteps moving through the undergrowth or the sound of branches being pushed aside by something large. But the sounds were distant and brief, and Brandon couldn't be certain that they represented anything more than his imagination working on the day's disturbing discoveries. Dawn of the fourth day revealed a changed landscape. During the night, someone or something had visited their campsite. Brandon emerged from his tent to find clear evidence that they were no longer alone in the wilderness. The most obvious sign was a series of large footprints in the soft earth around their camp, prints that matched those he had discovered the previous afternoon. The tracks formed a rough circle around their campsite, as if the creature had approached during the night and carefully observed their camp from multiple positions. The prints came to within 20 feet of Brandon's tent at their closest point, close enough that any large creature should have been clearly audible during its approach. Yet neither Brandon nor Scout had detected the visitor until morning revealed the evidence of its presence. Even more disturbing was the arrangement of objects around their campsite. Several large rocks had been moved from their original positions and arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern near the edge of their camp. The rocks were far too heavy for a single person to move easily, yet they had been positioned with what seemed like purposeful intent. Brandon could think of no natural process that would account for such an arrangement. Scout's behavior had deteriorated significantly overnight. The dog showed clear signs of stress and fear, refusing to eat his morning food and staying as close to Brandon as possible. His constant alertness had given way to obvious anxiety, and he frequently looked toward the forest with expressions of unmistakable concern. For the first time in their 3 years together, Scout seemed to be questioning whether remaining in their current location was safe. Brandon's scientific training battled with his growing sense of unease as he documented the evidence of their nighttime visitor. The footprints were even clearer than those he had discovered the previous day, pressed into the soft soil with unmistakable clarity. The measurements confirmed his earlier findings. A bipedal creature of enormous size and weight had approached their camp during the night and observed them from close range. The implications of this discovery were profound and deeply unsettling. They were sharing the valley with something that appeared to be intelligent, curious about human presence, and capable of moving with remarkable stealth despite its size. The creature's ability to approach so closely without detection suggested a level of wilderness skill that exceeded even Brandon's considerable experience. As Brandon prepared breakfast with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to remain calm, he was forced to confront the reality that their wilderness expedition had become something far different from the routine geological survey he had planned. The evidence was clear and undeniable. They were not alone in the valley, and their visitor was unlike anything in his experience or scientific training. The fourth day's planned activities included a comprehensive survey of the eastern portion of the valley, an area that appeared to contain complex geological formations and possibly evidence of past mining activity. But the events of the previous day and night had changed Brandon's priorities dramatically. The scientific objectives of his expedition remained important, but they were now secondary to the larger questions raised by their mysterious visitor. Scout's reluctance to leave the immediate area of their campsite had become pronounced to the point of near refusal. The dog would follow Brandon short distances from their camp, but his body language clearly indicated extreme reluctance and anxiety about venturing into the broader valley. This behavior was so contrary to Scout's normal enthusiasm for exploration that Brandon found it impossible to ignore. Despite Scout's obvious concerns, Brandon decided to proceed with a limited survey of the Eastern Valley, staying within a reasonable distance of their campsite and maintaining constant awareness of their surroundings. The geological work needed to be completed, and abandoning their expedition based on circumstantial evidence of an unknown creature would be difficult to justify in his official report. The eastern portion of the valley proved to contain some of the most interesting geological formations Brandon had encountered during his survey. Exposed rock faces showed clear evidence of complex mineral deposits, and several areas contained what appeared to be quartz veins that might have commercial potential. Under normal circumstances, these discoveries would have captured his complete attention and enthusiasm, but circumstances were far from normal. Throughout the morning's work, Brandon found himself constantly scanning the forest around them, looking for any sign of movement or evidence of observation. Scout remained close by, his alertness so intense that Brandon began to wonder whether the dog's acute senses were detecting something that remained hidden from human perception. It was while documenting a particularly interesting mineral formation that Brandon made his next disturbing discovery. Hidden among a cluster of large boulders at the base of an exposed rock face, he found what appeared to be a carefully constructed shelter or hiding place. The structure was subtle and expertly camouflaged, but clearly artificial in its arrangement. Large rocks had been positioned to create a concealed observation post that provided an excellent view of the valley floor while remaining hidden from casual observation. The construction showed clear evidence of intelligence and planning, with rocks carefully selected and positioned to provide both concealment and comfort for an occupant. The size of the structure suggested that it had been built for something much larger than a human being. Inside the shelter, Brandon found additional evidence of its recent use. The ground was compressed and worn smooth, as if something large had spent considerable time in the position. Several large pieces of tree bark had been arranged to create a more comfortable surface, and the bark showed clear signs of recent handling and arrangement. Most disturbing of all was the view from the shelter. The carefully positioned rocks provided an unobstructed line of sight to Brandon's campsite, nearly a quarter-mile distant. Someone or something had constructed this observation post specifically to watch their camp, and the evidence suggested that it had been used recently and perhaps repeatedly. Brandon photographed the shelter from multiple angles, documenting its construction and location with the same careful attention to detail he applied to his geological work. The implications of this discovery were profound. They were dealing with something that demonstrated clear intelligence, planning ability, and specific interest in human activity. The creature was not simply sharing their valley, it was actively observing them. Scout's behavior near the shelter was even more pronounced than his previous reactions. The dog refused to approach within several yards of the structure and showed clear signs of extreme agitation. His hackles remained raised throughout their investigation, and he emitted low, continuous whines that spoke of deep unease and fear. As they prepared to leave the area and return to their campsite, Brandon noticed additional evidence of the creature's presence. Several trees in the vicinity of the shelter showed signs of having been deliberately marked or damaged. Scratches high on the bark of mature aspens and pines suggested that something large and powerful had used the trees as marking posts, leaving clear evidence of its presence and perhaps its territorial claims. The scratches were positioned 8 to 10 feet above the ground, far higher than any known animal in the region could reach. The marks appeared to have been made by something with considerable strength, gouging deep furrows in the bark of mature trees. Some of the scratches appeared fresh, possibly made within the last few days, while others showed signs of weathering that suggested they were weeks or months old. The pattern of tree markings extended throughout the area around the shelter, creating what appeared to be a territorial boundary or communication system. Brandon had read about similar behavior in various animal species, but the height and intensity of these markings suggested something far larger and more powerful than any known wildlife in the region. The return to their campsite was accomplished in growing darkness and with increasing urgency. Brandon found himself moving more quickly than usual, driven by a growing sense that their presence in the valley was being monitored and evaluated by something with intelligence and capabilities that exceeded his understanding. Scout's behavior had deteriorated to the point where the dog was showing clear signs of panic and desperation to leave the area. Back at their campsite, Brandon spent the evening reviewing the day's discoveries and trying to make sense of the accumulating evidence. The observation shelter represented a level of intelligence and planning that challenged his understanding of what they might be dealing with. Combined with the footprints, tree markings, and Scout's obvious terror, the evidence pointed toward the presence of something that existed outside the boundaries of conventional scientific knowledge. The fourth night was the most difficult yet. Scout refused to settle down outside the tent, instead positioning himself inside the small shelter and maintaining constant vigilance. The dog's obvious terror was more unsettling to Brandon than any of the physical evidence they had discovered during the day. Scout's senses and instincts were far more acute than his own, and the dog's fear suggested that whatever they were sharing the valley with represented a genuine threat. Several times during the night, Brandon was awakened by sounds that seemed to come from the forest around their campsite. The sounds were subtle but unmistakable: the soft thud of heavy footsteps, the rustle of branches being pushed aside, and occasionally what sounded like quiet breathing or sniffing. Each time Brandon investigated, he found nothing visible, but the sounds were too consistent and specific to be dismissed as imagination. The most unnerving incident occurred in the early morning hours, when Brandon was awakened by a sound unlike anything he had heard before. It was a vocalization of some kind, deep, resonant, and unmistakably intelligent in its intonation. The sound seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, as if several creatures were communicating with each other using a complex system of calls and responses. The vocalizations continued for nearly 10 minutes, rising and falling in pitch and intensity with what appeared to be meaningful patterns. Brandon lay in his sleeping bag, hardly daring to breathe, as the sounds surrounded their campsite. Scout trembled against his side, too terrified to even whine or growl in response to the mysterious calls. When the sounds finally ceased, the silence that followed was profound and somehow more threatening than the vocalizations themselves. Brandon remained awake for the rest of the night, listening for any indication that their visitors might return. The experience had crossed a line from mysterious to genuinely frightening, and he began to seriously consider the possibility that their expedition needed to be terminated earlier than planned. Dawn of the fifth day revealed the most disturbing evidence yet of their mysterious visitors. During the night, someone or something had approached their campsite and left unmistakable signs of its presence. The first thing Brandon noticed was that their food supplies, which had been securely stored in a bear-resistant container, had been moved. The container itself was undamaged, but it had been relocated approximately 20 feet from its original position. More alarming was the discovery of additional footprints, this time showing clear evidence that multiple creatures had visited their campsite during the night. The tracks indicated at least 2 and possibly 3 different individuals, all leaving prints similar to those Brandon had documented earlier. The creatures had approached from different directions and had apparently spent considerable time investigating their camp and equipment. Several pieces of equipment had been moved or rearranged during the night. Brandon's geological tools, which had been neatly organized near his tent, were scattered across a wider area. Nothing was damaged or missing, but the rearrangement suggested that the creatures had carefully examined each item, perhaps trying to understand its purpose and function. Most unsettling of all was evidence that the creatures had attempted to open or investigate their tent during the night. Clear, hand-like prints were visible on the tent fabric, showing what appeared to be 5-fingered appendages with remarkable size and apparent dexterity. The prints on the tent showed that something had carefully examined the structure without damaging it, displaying a level of restraint and intelligence that made the experience even more unsettling. Scout's condition had deteriorated overnight, to the point where Brandon began to worry about the dog's health and well-being. Scout was refusing to eat, showed signs of extreme stress and anxiety, and had begun to exhibit behaviors that bordered on panic. The dog's obvious terror was affecting Brandon's own psychological state, creating a feedback loop of fear and uncertainty that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. As Brandon documented the night's evidence with his camera and notebook, he was forced to confront the reality that their expedition had become something far beyond a routine geological survey. They were in contact with something that demonstrated clear intelligence, curiosity about human presence, and capabilities that challenged conventional understanding of wildlife in the region. The decision to terminate their expedition and return to civilization was made easier by practical considerations. Their food supplies were sufficient for several more days, but Scout's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Brandon's own psychological state was being affected by the constant stress and uncertainty. More importantly, the creature's behavior was becoming increasingly bold, and Brandon feared that their presence might provoke a more direct confrontation. The plan for departure was complicated by several factors. The most direct route back to the trailhead would require crossing terrain where they had encountered the most evidence of creature activity. Alternative routes would add considerable distance and difficulty to their journey, but might provide a safer path away from whatever was monitoring their movements. Brandon decided to attempt departure via their original route, hoping that daylight travel would provide better visibility and earlier warning of any potential encounters. Scout's obvious terror suggested that the dog's acute senses were detecting threats that remained hidden from human perception, and Brandon hoped that the dog's natural alertness would provide sufficient early warning of any dangerous situations. The process of breaking camp and preparing for departure was accomplished with constant attention to their surroundings and growing urgency. Brandon packed only essential equipment, abandoning some geological samples and unnecessary gear in favor of speed and mobility. Scout remained close by throughout the packing process, showing obvious relief that they were finally preparing to leave the valley. As they prepared to depart their campsite for the final time, Brandon took a last look around the valley that had been home to their extraordinary and terrifying experience. The morning mist was beginning to lift from the forest floor, revealing the pristine wilderness that had initially seemed so peaceful and welcoming. Now the same landscape seemed filled with hidden threats and watching eyes, transformed by knowledge into something alien and dangerous. The initial portion of their departure proceeded without obvious incident, but Brandon remained acutely aware that their movements were likely being observed and monitored. Scout's behavior indicated continued high levels of stress and alertness, and the dog frequently stopped to sample the air for scents that might indicate the presence of their mysterious watchers. As they climbed out of the valley toward the ridgeline that would take them back toward the established trail, Brandon began to hope that they might escape without further direct contact with whatever had been monitoring their presence. The physical exertion of climbing with heavy packs provided a welcome distraction from the psychological stress of the previous days, and Scout seemed to show slight improvement in his demeanor as they gained distance from their campsite. It was while they were traversing a particularly steep and rocky section of the ridgeline that Brandon heard the first sounds of pursuit. Initially, the sounds were subtle, perhaps the rustle of vegetation or the dislodging of loose rocks somewhere behind them. But as they continued climbing, the sounds became more distinct and purposeful, clearly indicating that something large was following their route up the mountainside. Scout's reaction to the sounds of pursuit was immediate and dramatic. The dog's stress level, which had begun to improve during their climb, suddenly spiked to new levels of panic and terror. Scout began to whine continuously and pull strongly on his leash, desperate to increase their pace, despite the difficult terrain and heavy loads they were carrying. Brandon attempted to increase their climbing pace, but the steep terrain and heavy packs limited how quickly they could safely move. The sounds of pursuit continued to grow closer, accompanied by what appeared to be additional sounds from other directions. It became apparent that multiple creatures were converging on their position, approaching from different angles and elevations with what seemed like coordinated intent. The first clear visual contact occurred as they reached a relatively open area on the ridgeline where scattered trees provided limited concealment. Brandon caught a glimpse of movement in the forest below them, something large and dark, moving with remarkable speed and agility through terrain that would challenge even experienced human climbers. The size and speed of movement confirmed his worst fears about what had been monitoring their presence in the valley. Scout's terror reached a breaking point, and the dog began to pull so strongly against his leash that Brandon feared he might injure himself. The normally well-trained and obedient animal was responding to threats that his acute senses detected more clearly than human perception could provide. Brandon made the difficult decision to release Scout from his leash, hoping that the dog's natural speed and agility would allow him to escape whatever dangers were approaching. Scout immediately bolted up the mountainside, moving faster than Brandon had ever seen him travel. The dog's obvious panic was both heartbreaking and terrifying, confirming that whatever was pursuing them represented a genuine and immediate threat to their safety. Brandon attempted to follow Scout's route, but his heavy pack and human limitations made it impossible to match the dog's pace. The sounds of pursuit intensified as Brandon struggled up the steep mountainside, now clearly audible as the heavy footfalls of multiple large creatures moving through the forest with deliberate intent. The coordination and persistence of their pursuers suggested intelligence and planning that went far beyond simple animal curiosity or territorial behavior. It was during this desperate climb that Brandon experienced the most terrifying moment of their entire expedition. As he paused to catch his breath and assess his situation, a rock the size of a bowling ball crashed into a fallen log less than 3 feet from his position. The impact shattered the log with tremendous force, sending splinters and debris flying in all directions and leaving no doubt about the power and accuracy of whatever had thrown it. The rock had been hurled from somewhere below Brandon's position with remarkable accuracy and devastating force. The precision of the throw suggested intelligence and intent, while the power behind it demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything Brandon had imagined possible. The shattered log provided unmistakable evidence of the dangerous situation he now faced. Additional rocks began to rain down on Brandon's position, each thrown with similar accuracy and force. The bombardment was clearly intended to trap him in his current position, preventing further progress up the mountainside while the creatures closed in from other directions. Brandon realized that he was facing a coordinated attack by multiple intelligent adversaries with capabilities that far exceeded his own. The only option for escape was to abandon his heavy pack and attempt to reach more defensible terrain higher on the mountainside. Brandon quickly shed his geological equipment and most of his camping gear, retaining only essential items that might aid in his survival. The decision to abandon thousands of dollars worth of scientific equipment was made easier by the immediate threat to his life. Moving without the weight of his pack, Brandon was able to increase his climbing pace significantly, but the bombardment of rocks continued with terrifying accuracy and power. Several projectiles passed close enough to his position that he could feel the wind from their passage, and the continued destruction of trees and rocks around him provided constant reminders of what would happen if one of the thrown stones found its target. As Brandon climbed desperately toward what appeared to be more defensible terrain, he caught additional glimpses of his pursuers moving through the forest below. The creatures were large, powerful, and moved with a combination of intelligence and physical capability that exceeded anything in his experience or scientific training. Their coordination and persistence suggested that escape would require reaching terrain that even they could not easily traverse. The bombardment continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, with rocks crashing around Brandon's position with mechanical regularity and devastating accuracy. The psychological impact of the attack was perhaps as significant as the physical danger, demonstrating clearly that he was facing adversaries with capabilities and intelligence that exceeded conventional understanding. Scout had reached a position high on the ridgeline and was barking frantically, apparently attempting to call Brandon to safety while remaining beyond the range of the rock bombardment. The dog's obvious distress added another layer of urgency to Brandon's desperate attempt to escape, but also provided a beacon toward which he could direct his climbing efforts. The terrain near the ridgeline became increasingly rocky and steep, providing better handholds for climbing, but also greater exposure to accurately thrown projectiles. Brandon's progress became a desperate scramble from one sheltered position to another, timing his movements to avoid the continuing bombardment while gaining elevation as quickly as possible. It was during this final phase of his escape that Brandon experienced the most terrifying moment of the entire ordeal. As he paused behind a large boulder to catch his breath and plan his next movement, he heard the unmistakable sound of something large moving directly above his position. Looking up, he caught a clear view of what had been pursuing him through the forest. The creature was enormous, easily 8 feet tall and covered with dark, coarse hair. Its build was massively muscular but unmistakably bipedal, with long arms and a face that combined human and ape-like features in a way that defied conventional understanding of evolution and biology. The intelligence in its eyes was unmistakable, as was its obvious assessment of Brandon as both threat and prey. For a moment that lasted an eternity, human and creature stared at each other across a distance of perhaps 20 feet. Brandon could see the power and intelligence in the creature's form, while the being seemed to be evaluating him with careful attention to his capabilities and potential for escape. The moment was broken when the creature raised another large rock, clearly preparing to eliminate the threat that Brandon represented to its territory and perhaps its kind. Brandon's escape from immediate danger was accomplished through a combination of desperation, adrenaline, and sheer luck. As the creature prepared to throw what would certainly have been a fatal projectile, a loose section of the slope gave way beneath its position, sending the being tumbling down the mountainside in a cascade of rocks and debris. The momentary distraction provided Brandon with the opportunity to complete his climb to the ridgeline and relative safety. Scout greeted Brandon's arrival at the ridgeline with obvious relief, but both human and dog remained acutely aware that their escape was far from complete. The creatures below had demonstrated remarkable climbing ability and persistence, and there was no guarantee that the terrain advantage of the ridgeline would provide permanent safety from pursuit. The remainder of their escape from the valley was accomplished in a state of constant alertness and maximum speed, consistent with safety. Brandon and Scout moved along the ridgeline as quickly as possible, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers, while constantly monitoring for signs of continued pursuit. The psychological impact of their encounter made every sound and shadow a potential threat, transforming familiar terrain into a landscape of danger and uncertainty. The descent from the ridgeline toward the established trail was accomplished without further direct contact with their pursuers, but Brandon remained convinced that their movements were being monitored by unseen watchers throughout their escape. Scout's behavior continued to indicate high levels of stress and alertness, suggesting that the dog's acute senses were detecting threats that remained hidden from human perception. Reaching the established trail provided a psychological boost, but Brandon understood that their safety was far from assured until they reached their vehicle and could leave the area entirely. The final miles of hiking were accomplished at maximum sustainable pace, with frequent stops to listen for sounds of pursuit and constant attention to Scout's behavior for early warning of approaching danger. The sight of Brandon's truck at the trailhead was perhaps the most welcome vision of his entire life. The vehicle represented safety, escape, and return to a world where the events of the previous days could be processed and understood within familiar frameworks of logic and science. Scout's obvious relief at reaching the vehicle confirmed that both human and dog understood their ordeal was finally approaching an end. The drive away from the trailhead and back toward civilization was accomplished in relative silence, with Brandon's mind struggling to process the events of their expedition and their implications for his understanding of the natural world. Scout slept in the passenger seat, exhausted by days of constant stress and terror, but clearly relieved to be leaving the wilderness behind. The immediate aftermath of their expedition was characterized by a complex mixture of relief, confusion, and uncertainty about how to deal with what they had experienced. Brandon's scientific training demanded that he document and report his findings, but the extraordinary nature of their encounter raised questions about credibility and professional reputation that were difficult to resolve. The physical evidence from their expedition was limited but compelling. Brandon's photographs of the footprints and tree markings provided clear documentation of something unusual, but fell short of definitive proof of the creature's existence and capabilities. The shattered log from the rock bombardment represented perhaps the most dramatic physical evidence, but even this could potentially be explained by conventional causes to skeptical observers. Scout's condition provided additional evidence of their extraordinary experience. The normally confident and resilient dog required several weeks to return to normal behavior, showing clear signs of trauma and heightened alertness that gradually diminished over time. The psychological impact on Scout was perhaps more convincing than any physical evidence, demonstrating the profound effect of their encounter on a being with senses far more acute than human perception. Brandon's own psychological recovery from their expedition proved to be a longer and more complex process than he had anticipated. The experience had challenged fundamental assumptions about the natural world and his own understanding of what was possible within the framework of conventional science. Sleep was difficult for weeks following their return, with nightmares and anxiety attacks that required professional counseling to address effectively. The decision about whether to report their encounter officially proved to be one of the most difficult aspects of dealing with their experience. Brandon's position with the state's Department of Natural Resources required that he file a comprehensive report on his geological survey, but including details of their encounter with unknown creatures raised obvious questions about credibility and professional competence. Ultimately, Brandon chose to file a conventional geological report that focused on the scientific findings of his survey while omitting any reference to their extraordinary encounters. The mineral deposits and rock formations he had documented provided valuable scientific data that would benefit future research and potential economic development. And he saw no reason to compromise the value of this work by including unverifiable claims about unknown creatures. The suppression of their encounter details was made easier by the absence of corroborating witnesses and the limited nature of their physical evidence. Brandon understood that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and what they had experienced, while personally compelling, fell short of the standards needed to convince skeptical scientific observers of the reality of their encounters. However, Brandon did preserve all of his photographs, notes, and documentation from their expedition, storing them in a secure location against the possibility that future evidence might provide the context needed to make their experience credible to broader scientific scrutiny. The shattered log was carefully preserved and photographed, representing the most dramatic physical evidence of the creature's power and accuracy. In the months following their expedition, Brandon conducted extensive research into previous reports of similar encounters in the region and beyond. The historical record contained numerous accounts of large bipedal creatures in wilderness areas throughout North America, many bearing striking similarities to what he and Scout had experienced in their valley. Native American traditions included detailed descriptions of beings that matched their observations with remarkable consistency. The pattern of previous encounters suggested that their experience was part of a larger phenomenon that had been documented across time and geography, but which remained outside the boundaries of conventional scientific acceptance. The consistency of reports across different time periods and geographical regions provided some comfort to Brandon that their experience was not unique or the result of psychological aberration. Professional research into the possibility of unknown primate species in North America revealed a surprising amount of serious scientific interest in the question, despite the ridicule and skepticism that characterized public discussion of the topic. Several respected scientists had conducted investigations into reported encounters, and the accumulated evidence, while not conclusive, was more substantial than Brandon had expected. The long-term impact of their expedition on Brandon's career and personal life was significant but manageable. His geological work in the valley had produced valuable scientific data that enhanced his professional reputation, and his carefully edited report made no reference to the extraordinary aspects of their experience. Colleagues who knew him well noticed changes in his demeanor and interests, but attributed these to the normal effects of extended wilderness work. Scout's recovery proved to be more complete than Brandon had initially expected. The dog gradually returned to his normal confidence and enthusiasm for wilderness adventures, though he never again showed quite the same fearless curiosity about unknown scents and sounds that had characterized his behavior before their encounter. The experience had taught both human and dog valuable lessons about the limits of their understanding and the potential dangers that might exist beyond conventional awareness. Years after their expedition, Brandon continued to wrestle with questions about whether he had made the right decision in suppressing the extraordinary aspects of their experience. The scientific value of their geological discoveries was undeniable, But the potential significance of their encounter with unknown creatures raised questions about his responsibility to contribute to broader understanding of unexplained phenomena. The shattered log from their encounter remained in Brandon's possession, a physical reminder of the power and accuracy of their mysterious adversaries. Analysis of the wood fragments confirmed that the destruction had been caused by tremendous force, applied with remarkable precision, but stopped short of providing definitive proof of what had caused the damage. The log served as a private memorial to an experience that had forever changed his understanding of what was possible in the natural world. Occasional contact with other researchers and investigators interested in similar phenomena provided Brandon with opportunities to share his experience in confidential settings, contributing to a growing database of encounters that suggested a larger pattern beyond individual imagination or deception. These conversations reinforced his conviction that their experience had been real and significant, while also highlighting the complex challenges faced by anyone attempting to study or document such phenomena. The impact of their expedition on Brandon's personal relationship with wilderness areas was profound and lasting. While he continued his geological work in remote areas, he never again approached the wilderness with quite the same confidence and assumption of scientific understanding that had characterized his earlier career. The experience had taught him valuable lessons about humility and the limits of human knowledge, lessons that enriched both his scientific work and his personal relationship with the natural world. Scout's presence on subsequent expeditions became even more valuable, with Brandon paying much closer attention to the dog's behavior and responses to environmental changes. The dog's acute senses and natural alertness had provided early warning of their extraordinary encounter, and Brandon understood that Scout's perceptions often exceeded his own ability to detect subtle changes in their surroundings. The decision to eventually share their story years after the original experience was motivated by a growing sense that the scientific community and the broader public deserved access to carefully documented accounts of unexplained phenomena. The accumulation of similar reports from credible witnesses across time and geography suggested that dismissing such encounters without investigation represented a failure of scientific curiosity and intellectual honesty. Brandon's account of their expedition was ultimately prepared with the same attention to detail and scientific rigor that characterized his geological work, presenting their experience as objectively as possible while acknowledging the limitations of single witness testimony and the absence of definitive physical evidence. The goal was to contribute to a larger understanding of unexplained phenomena while maintaining the intellectual honesty that was fundamental to his scientific training. The response to Brandon's eventual disclosure of their encounter varied widely, from skeptical dismissal to serious interest from researchers and investigators working in related fields. The pattern of responses reinforced his understanding that extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, while also highlighting the complex challenges faced by anyone attempting to study phenomena that existed outside conventional scientific frameworks. In the end, Brandon's encounter in that remote Utah valley served as a transformative experience that changed his understanding of the natural world and his place within it. The geological discoveries from his expedition continued to contribute to scientific knowledge, while the extraordinary aspects of their experience served as a reminder that human understanding of the natural world remained incomplete and subject to revision based on new evidence and experiences. The shattered log remained in Brandon's possession as a tangible reminder of their encounter, a piece of physical evidence that documented the power and accuracy of forces beyond conventional understanding. Whether future investigation would provide the context needed to fully understand their experience remained an open question, But the reality of what they had witnessed continued to influence Brandon's approach to both his scientific work and his personal relationship with the wilderness. Scout lived for many years after their expedition, eventually passing away peacefully in old age with his master at his side. The dog's loyalty and courage during their extraordinary encounter had strengthened their bond beyond normal pet-owner relationships, creating a partnership based on shared experience and mutual respect that lasted throughout Scout's lifetime. In his final years, Scout showed no signs of lingering trauma from their encounter, suggesting that his natural resilience had allowed him to process and integrate their experience more successfully than his human companion. The valley where they had their encounter remained unchanged, continuing to exist as a pristine wilderness area that showed no signs of human intrusion beyond the minimal impact of Brandon's geological survey. Whether the creatures they had encountered continued to inhabit the area remained unknown. But Brandon felt confident that the valley's remote location and challenging terrain would continue to provide protection for whatever mysteries it might contain. Brandon's career in geology continued for many years, with numerous expeditions to remote wilderness areas throughout the American West. The experience in Utah had taught him valuable lessons about wilderness travel and safety that proved useful on subsequent expeditions. Though he never again encountered anything that challenged his understanding of the natural world as profoundly as that September week in the Uinta Mountains. The question of whether to recommend further investigation of their encounter remained unresolved in Brandon's mind. The potential scientific value of documenting unknown species was enormous, but the risks to both researchers and the creatures themselves raised ethical questions that were difficult to resolve. The creatures had demonstrated remarkable intelligence and capabilities, suggesting that they deserved the same consideration and protection that would be afforded to any other intelligent species sharing the planet. In quiet moments of reflection, often while working alone in remote wilderness areas, Brandon continued to think about their encounter and its implications for human understanding of the natural world. The experience had taught him that scientific knowledge remained incomplete and subject to revision, and that maintaining an open mind about unexplained phenomena was essential for continued learning and discovery. The physical evidence from their expedition, carefully preserved and documented, served as a reminder that extraordinary experiences could occur even to careful, trained observers working within established scientific frameworks. Whether future developments would provide the context needed to fully understand and validate their encounter remained an open question, but Brandon remained committed to honest reporting of his observations, regardless of their implications for conventional understanding. Scout's memory lived on in Brandon's subsequent choice of canine companions, each selected and trained with an appreciation for the unique capabilities that dogs brought to wilderness exploration. The bond between human and dog, forged through shared experience and mutual dependence, had proven to be one of the most valuable aspects of Brandon's wilderness work, providing both practical assistance and emotional support during challenging expeditions. The transformation of Brandon's understanding of wilderness areas from places of scientific interest to complex ecosystems that might harbor intelligent life beyond human recognition had enriched his work, while also adding layers of responsibility and caution to his approach. Every expedition now included consideration of the possibility that human activities might be impacting unknown species or communities that had successfully avoided detection and documentation. Years of reflection on their encounter had convinced Brandon that the creatures they had met possessed intelligence, social organization, and territorial awareness that deserved respect and protection. The coordination and restraint they had demonstrated during the confrontation suggested a sophisticated understanding of human capabilities and limitations, as well as the wisdom to avoid unnecessary conflict while still defending their territory effectively. The decision to eventually share their story publicly represented a careful balance between scientific responsibility and personal credibility, with Brandon choosing to present their experience as objectively as possible, while acknowledging the limitations and uncertainties inherent in single witness accounts of extraordinary phenomena. The goal was to contribute to broader understanding while maintaining the intellectual honesty that was fundamental to his scientific training and professional reputation. Brandon's encounter served as a reminder that the natural world contained mysteries and complexities that exceeded human understanding, and that maintaining humility and openness to new possibilities was essential for continued learning and discovery. The experience had transformed his relationship with wilderness areas from one of scientific mastery to one of respectful collaboration with ecosystems and communities that might include forms of intelligence beyond human recognition or understanding. The shattered log, preserved as the most dramatic physical evidence of their encounter, continued to serve as a tangible reminder that extraordinary events could occur even to careful, trained observers working within established scientific frameworks. Whether future investigation would provide the context needed to fully understand their experience remained an open question. But the reality of what they had witnessed continued to influence Brandon's approach to both his scientific work and his personal relationship with the natural world. The next case, James Mitchell had been tracking animals through the wilderness for 23 years, but nothing in his extensive experience as a wildlife biologist had prepared him for what he would encounter in the dense forests of the Olympic Peninsula that October. The 42-year-old researcher from the University of Washington had built his reputation on methodical observation and scientific rigor, qualities that had earned him tenure and respect among his peers. His weathered hands, scarred from countless hours in the field, and his keen grey eyes that missed nothing in the natural world had made him the go-to expert for wildlife behavior studies across the Pacific Northwest. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline air that made every sound carry for miles through the towering Douglas firs and western red cedars. James had risen before dawn in his small cabin near Lake Cushman, preparing for what was supposed to be a routine elk migration study. The Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife had commissioned him to document the seasonal movement patterns of the Roosevelt elk population, particularly in the remote areas where human interaction was minimal and the animals followed ancient paths through the mountains. His companion for this expedition was Rex, a 7-year-old German Shepherd mix, whose intelligence and tracking abilities had made him invaluable on dozens of previous research trips. Rex stood 3 feet at the shoulder, with a thick coat of black and tan fur that served him well in the cold mountain air. The dog's amber eyes held an alertness that James had come to trust implicitly over the years they had worked together. Rex could detect the presence of wildlife long before James's human senses registered anything unusual, and his calm demeanor around most forest creatures made him an ideal research partner. James loaded his forest green pickup truck with equipment that represented years of careful selection and refinement. His camera gear included 2 digital SLRs with telephoto lenses capable of capturing clear images at distances up to 500 yards, along with a selection of wide-angle lenses for habitat documentation. Motion-activated trail cameras filled 3 waterproof cases, each device capable of recording high-definition video triggered by heat and movement. His GPS units were military-grade, capable of maintaining satellite connection even under the heaviest forest canopy, and his communication equipment included both satellite phone and emergency beacon systems. The drive up the winding mountain roads took 2 hours, with James stopping frequently to check his maps and GPS coordinates. The study area lay in a section of the Olympic National Forest that saw fewer than 50 visitors per year, accessible only by a network of deteriorating logging roads that hadn't been maintained since the timber industry pulled out in the early 1990s. The isolation was precisely what made it ideal for elk research, but it also meant that help would be days away if anything went wrong. James parked his truck at the end of the last passable road, where a rusted gate marked the boundary of the research area. Beyond this point, he would travel on foot, carrying everything he needed for the 5-day study in a 70-pound pack. Rex bounded from the truck eagerly, immediately investigating the rich scents that the mountain air carried. The dog's behavior was normal, excited but controlled, showing none of the nervous energy that James had learned to associate with predator presence. The first 2 miles of hiking followed an old fire road that wound steadily upward through second-growth forest. James maintained a steady pace, stopping every quarter-mile to mark GPS waypoints and photograph notable features of the terrain. The road surface, broken by decades of weather and neglect, provided clear evidence of the area's isolation. Apart from his own footprints from previous visits, James saw no human sign newer than the old tire tracks left by logging equipment 15 years earlier. As they climbed higher, the forest changed character. The second-growth timber gave way to old-growth giants, some of them over 6 feet in diameter and reaching heights that disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. The understory became denser, filled with sword ferns, Oregon grape, and devil's club that created a green maze beneath the towering trees. Visibility dropped to less than 50 yards in most directions, and the forest floor became a thick carpet of moss and fallen needles that muffled every footstep. By late morning, James reached the first of his predetermined observation points, a ridge that offered a clear view down into the Squamish River Valley, where the elk were expected to pass. He unpacked his spotting scope and began the methodical process of glassing the valley floor, searching for the characteristic movement patterns that would indicate the presence of the herd. Rex lay quietly beside him, occasionally lifting his head to test the wind, but showing no signs of agitation. The silence of the deep forest was absolute, broken only by the distant call of a Steller's jay and the whisper of wind through the high branches. James had spent enough time in wilderness areas to appreciate this profound quiet, understanding that it represented a healthy ecosystem where human disturbance was minimal. As he scanned the valley through his scope, he made careful notes in his waterproof field journal, documenting weather conditions, vegetation state, and the general character of the terrain. Around noon, Rex's behavior began to change subtly. The dog's ears, which had been relaxed against his head, became erect and alert. His nose worked constantly, testing every shift in the air currents, and his body posture grew tense. James noticed the change immediately, setting down his scope to observe Rex more carefully. In their years of working together, he had learned to read the dog's signals like a second language, and this level of alertness usually meant the presence of large wildlife nearby. James began his own careful scan of the surrounding forest, looking for movement or anything out of place. His trained eye swept methodically across the terrain, noting the position of every fallen log, the pattern of light and shadow, the normal rhythm of the forest. For several minutes he detected nothing unusual, but Rex's agitation continued to increase. The dog began moving in tight circles, whining softly under his breath, behavior that James had never seen before in all their time together. The first sign that something was genuinely wrong came when the forest fell completely silent. The background chorus of bird calls that had provided a constant soundtrack to the morning suddenly stopped, as if someone had thrown a switch. James had experienced this phenomenon before, usually when a major predator like a cougar was moving through the area, but the completeness of the silence was unusual. Even insects seemed to have stopped their activities, creating a dead acoustic space that felt profoundly unnatural. Rex's whining grew more pronounced, and he began pawing at James's leg, trying to get his attention. The dog's amber eyes showed a level of concern that James had never seen before, not even during encounters with black bears or aggressive elk bulls. Something in the forest was triggering Rex's deepest instincts, sending signals that spoke of danger on a level that transcended normal predator-prey relationships. James carefully packed his spotting scope and shouldered his pack, deciding to relocate to a different observation point. As he prepared to move, Rex suddenly froze, his entire body going rigid as he stared into the forest behind them. The dog's hackles rose, creating a ridge of standing fur along his spine, and his lips pulled back to expose his teeth. A low growl rumbled in his throat, unlike any sound James had heard him make before. Following Rex's gaze, James peered into the dense vegetation, but could see nothing that would explain the dog's extreme reaction. The forest remained motionless, with no visible movement among the trees and undergrowth. But as he continued to watch, James became aware of a subtle wrongness in the scene before him. The spacing of the trees seemed somehow different, as if something large was standing among them, disrupting the natural pattern without being clearly visible. The feeling of being watched settled over James like a physical weight. His skin prickled with the primitive awareness that every human carries deep in their evolutionary memory, the recognition of being studied by something that sees them as potential prey. He found himself holding his breath, listening for any sound that would reveal the location of whatever was observing them, but the silence remained absolute. Rex's growling intensified, and he took several steps backward, pressing against James's legs. The dog's usual courage seemed to have evaporated, replaced by a fear so profound that it overrode his normal protective instincts. James had seen Rex face down, charging elk, and stand his ground against black bears, but whatever was hidden in the forest ahead of them had reduced his brave companion to a trembling, terrified animal. James began backing away slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the area where Rex was staring. Every instinct told him to turn and run, but his scientific training demanded that he maintain observation and try to identify what was causing such an extreme reaction. As they retreated step by step, James became increasingly aware of a smell that hadn't been present earlier, a musky animal odor that seemed to combine the worst aspects of wet fur, rotting vegetation, and something else entirely, something that triggered disgust on a cellular level. The sound, when it came, was unlike anything in James's extensive catalogue of wildlife vocalizations. It began as a low rumble, almost below the threshold of hearing, then rose to become a haunting moan that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound carried notes of intelligence and emotion that were profoundly disturbing, suggesting awareness and intention rather than simple animal communication. Rex's response was immediate and extreme. The dog bolted past James, running in the direction they had come, his courage completely shattered. James stood alone in the forest, his heart hammering in his chest as the echoes of that impossible sound faded into silence. Every rational part of his mind searched for an explanation that would fit within his understanding of the natural world. He had heard bull elk bugle during rutting season, had listened to the territorial roars of mountain lions, had even encountered the rare whoops and screams of fisher cats, but nothing in his experience matched what he had just heard. The forest remained silent for several long minutes, as if waiting to see what James would do next. He found himself caught between scientific curiosity and primitive fear, part of him wanting to advance toward whatever had made that sound, while every survival instinct screamed at him to follow Rex's example and flee. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his camera, the photographer's instinct to document what he was experiencing, overriding his terror. As James raised the camera to his eye, movement caught his peripheral vision. Something large was shifting among the trees, staying just beyond the range of clear visibility, but definitely there, definitely watching him. The movement was deliberate and intelligent, showing an awareness of cover and concealment that suggested reasoning ability far beyond normal animal behavior. Whatever was observing him understood that it was being hunted and was taking steps to remain hidden while continuing its own surveillance. James adjusted his camera settings for the low light conditions under the forest canopy, his hands working automatically while his mind struggled to process what he was experiencing. The telephoto lens allowed him to examine the area of movement more closely, but whatever was there seemed to possess an uncanny ability to stay just out of focus, using the natural cover of the forest with an expertise that spoke of long practice and intelligence. The second vocalization was closer, louder, and carried notes of what could only be described as warning. The sound rose from a growl to a roar that seemed to shake the very trees, demonstrating lung capacity and vocal power that dwarfed anything James had ever encountered. Rex's panicked barking echoed from somewhere far down the trail, the dog apparently having run several hundred yards before stopping. James began backing away more quickly, no longer concerned with maintaining scientific objectivity. Whatever was in the forest with him was large, intelligent, and clearly agitated by his presence. His camera captured frame after frame of shadows and vegetation, but nothing definitive emerged from the images as he reviewed them on the camera's LCD screen. The creature, for he had no doubt now that he was dealing with something living and aware, possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain hidden. As he continued his retreat, James became aware that he was being herded. The sounds of movement in the forest were guiding him along a specific path, cutting off certain directions while leaving others open. The intelligence behind this behavior was unmistakable, suggesting not just awareness, but tactical thinking and the ability to plan several moves ahead. James found himself being pushed toward a section of forest where the trees grew more densely and escape routes would be limited. The realization that he was being manipulated triggered a spike of adrenaline that cleared his thinking. James broke from the path he was being forced to follow, crashing through the undergrowth toward what he hoped was a more defensible position. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit began immediately, no longer subtle or hidden but openly aggressive. Something large was moving through the forest at speed, breaking branches and disturbing vegetation in a way that suggested massive size and strength. James reached a small clearing where a lightning strike had brought down several large trees, creating a natural barricade that offered some protection. He pressed his back against one of the fallen giants and raised his camera, determined to capture evidence of whatever was pursuing him. The sounds of approach grew closer, and he could hear Rex barking frantically from somewhere in the distance, the dog apparently trying to return despite his terror. The first clear sighting lasted only seconds, but those seconds burned themselves into James's memory with perfect clarity. The creature that emerged from the tree line stood nearly 9 feet tall, its massive frame covered in dark, matted hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The head was proportionally large, even for the enormous body, with a pronounced brow ridge that shadowed eyes that glowed with unmistakable intelligence. The arms were disproportionately long, hanging nearly to the creature's knees, and the hands that terminated those arms showed manipulation capabilities that went far beyond simple grasping. James's camera fired rapidly, the motor drive whirring as frame after frame captured the impossible sight before him. The creature's face showed an expression that combined curiosity with growing irritation, as if it was studying James with the same intensity that he was studying it. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, predator and prey examined each other across the small clearing, each taking the measure of the other. The creature's mouth opened, revealing teeth that were clearly adapted for both vegetarian and carnivorous diets, but the size of the canines suggested that meat was definitely on the menu. The sound that emerged was the same haunting vocalization that James had heard earlier, but at close range, its complexity became apparent. There were subtleties in the call that suggested language, communication patterns that spoke of a sophisticated social structure and intelligence that might rival that of humans. James continued photographing until the creature took a step forward, closing the distance between them by several feet. The massive foot, easily 18 inches long and proportionally wide, left a clear impression in the soft earth of the clearing. The sight of that footprint, undeniably real and impossible to explain away, shattered the last of James's rational skepticism. He was face to face with something that officially didn't exist, something that challenged every assumption about the natural world that his scientific training had built. The creature's advance triggered James's flight response. He scrambled over the fallen log behind him and began running through the forest, abandoning any pretense of scientific observation in favor of simple survival. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of pursuit, but they were controlled and measured rather than frantic. The creature was following him, but not with the all-out effort that would indicate a serious hunting attempt. Instead, it seemed to be testing him, observing his capabilities and reactions. Rex's barking grew closer, and James could see flashes of movement through the trees as the dog approached from the direction of the main trail. The loyal animal had overcome his terror enough to return, drawn by his bond with James, despite every instinct telling him to flee. The sight of Rex brought a surge of hope to James's panicked mind, but it also filled him with dread for his companion's safety. The reunion between man and dog lasted only seconds before Rex's attention was drawn to something behind them. The dog's hackles rose again, and he positioned himself between James and the approaching threat, his body language showing protective aggression, overlaying profound fear. Rex's loyalty had overcome his terror, but James could see that the dog was operating on the very edge of his psychological limits. The creature emerged from the forest again, this time showing less caution about revealing itself. In the fuller light of the clearing, its massive size became even more apparent. James estimated its weight at well over 600 pounds, all of it muscle and bone, covered by that dark, matted hair. The creature's posture was erect and bipedal, but there was a fluidity to its movement that suggested it was equally comfortable on four limbs when the situation required it. Rex's protective stance lasted only until the creature fixed its attention on him. The dog's courage crumbled under that intelligent gaze, and he began backing away, whimpering and pawing at the ground. James watched in horror as his brave companion, who had faced down every challenge the wilderness could offer, was reduced to a terrified animal by the mere presence of this impossible creature. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. James found himself caught between the urge to flee and the scientific compulsion to observe and document. His camera had stopped working, whether from his sweating hands fouling the controls or from simple equipment failure under stress, he couldn't tell. But the images were burned into his memory with a clarity that no photograph could match. The creature began moving again, circling the clearing with a deliberate pace that kept James and Rex at the center of its attention. Its movement pattern was clearly designed to cut off escape routes while maintaining visual contact, demonstrating planning ability and tactical awareness that suggested intelligence, at least equal to that of humans. James found himself being studied like a laboratory specimen, examined by something that understood the concept of research and investigation. Rex's nerve finally broke completely. The dog turned and fled into the forest, his panicked barking echoing through the trees as he ran. James started to follow, but the creature's response was immediate and decisive. It moved to block his path with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large, demonstrating agility and reflexes that spoke of a perfect adaptation to forest environments. James found himself alone with the creature, cut off from his companion and facing something that his rational mind insisted could not exist. The creature's behavior suggested that it had separated him from Rex deliberately, recognizing that the dog represented both a potential threat and a psychological anchor for James. Without Rex's presence, James felt his remaining courage beginning to desert him. The creature resumed its examination of James, moving closer with each circuit of the clearing. James could smell it now, that overwhelming musk that seemed to combine every unpleasant animal odor he had ever encountered. But beneath the primitive reek was something else, a scent that suggested intelligence and self-awareness, as if the creature understood the impact its presence was having and was choosing to use that psychological warfare deliberately. James began talking, his voice shaky but audible, addressing the creature as he might any intelligent being. He explained who he was, what he was doing in the forest, tried to communicate that he meant no harm and wanted only to observe and document. The creature's response was immediate and unmistakable. It tilted its head and focused its attention on James's voice with an intensity that suggested it was not only hearing, but listening, not only listening, but understanding. The communication attempt seemed to intrigue the creature rather than threaten it. The massive head tilted at different angles as James continued speaking, and there were subtle changes in its facial expression that suggested active processing of information. James began to realize that he was not just being observed, but was actively participating in a first contact situation with an intelligence that was both alien and familiar. The sound of Rex's return interrupted this extraordinary moment. The dog's barking was frantic and growing closer, and James could hear him crashing through the undergrowth with desperate urgency. The creature's attention shifted immediately to this new development, and its posture changed from curious observation to something approaching aggression. Rex represented an unknown variable in the situation, and the creature clearly viewed him as a potential threat. James called out to Rex, trying to warn the dog to stay away, but Rex's loyalty overcame any self-preservation instinct he might have retained. The dog burst into the clearing at full speed, placing himself between James and the creature, despite the terror that was clearly consuming him. Rex's courage in the face of overwhelming fear was both inspiring and heartbreaking, demonstrating the depth of the bond between man and dog that had developed over years of shared experiences. The creature's response to Rex's protective behavior was swift and decisive. It rose to its full height, easily 3 feet taller than James, and let loose a roar that seemed to shake the entire forest. The sound was not just loud, but physical, a wall of pressure that James could feel in his chest and bones. Rex's brave defiance crumbled under that acoustic assault, but the loyal dog held his ground, trembling with terror but refusing to abandon his human companion. What happened next would haunt James for the rest of his life. The creature reached down with one massive hand and grasped Rex around the middle, lifting the 70-pound dog off the ground as if he weighed nothing at all. Rex's yelps of pain and terror filled the clearing as those enormous fingers closed around his torso, demonstrating strength that could easily crush bone and organ. James found his voice, screaming at the creature to release Rex, offering himself in place of the dog, begging for mercy that he had no reason to expect. The creature looked at him with those intelligent eyes, and James saw something that might have been consideration, as if it was weighing his offer and deciding whether to accept the exchange. Rex's struggles were growing weaker, and James could see that the pressure was causing internal damage. The dog's eyes found his, and in that gaze James saw not accusation, but forgiveness, as if Rex understood that his human companion had not chosen this situation and bore no responsibility for what was happening. The loyalty and love in that final look broke something fundamental in James's heart. The creature's grip tightened, and Rex's struggles ceased. The sudden stillness was more horrifying than the previous violence, marking the moment when his brave companion's life ended. James felt something fundamental break inside him, a grief and rage so profound that it overcame even his terror of the massive creature that had just killed his best friend. The creature released Rex's lifeless body, letting it fall to the forest floor with a sound that James would hear in his nightmares for years to come. Those intelligent eyes fixed on James again, and he saw something that might have been regret, as if the creature understood the magnitude of what it had just done and the impact on the human who had witnessed it. James approached Rex's body, expecting the creature to stop him, but it stepped back and allowed him to kneel beside his fallen companion. Rex's amber eyes stared sightlessly at the forest canopy, and his body was still warm despite the traumatic injuries that had ended his life. James cradled the dog's head in his hands, overcome by grief and guilt that cut deeper than any physical wound. The creature watched this display of mourning with what appeared to be genuine interest, as if it was studying human emotional responses with the same scientific detachment that James had brought to his wildlife research. The intelligence behind those eyes was evaluating, cataloging, learning from this unprecedented interaction between species. When James finally looked up from Rex's body, the creature was gone. The forest had swallowed it as completely as if it had never existed, leaving no trace except the enormous footprints pressed into the soft earth and the body of the dog that had died trying to protect his human companion. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire forest was holding its breath in the aftermath of what had transpired. James sat beside Rex's body as the afternoon light faded into evening, unable to process what he had experienced or decide what he should do next. His scientific training demanded that he document everything, preserve the evidence, report his findings to the appropriate authorities. But another part of him, the part that understood how this story would be received, wanted to bury the experience and never speak of it again. As darkness began to fall, practical considerations forced James into action. He could not carry Rex's body out of the forest, and leaving it for scavengers was unthinkable. Using his folding shovel, James began digging a grave in the soft earth of the clearing, working by the light of his headlamp as tears streamed down his face. The work was exhausting both physically and emotionally, but it gave him something to focus on other than the magnitude of what he had witnessed. The burial took most of the night, and James marked the grave with a cairn of stones that would serve as a memorial to his faithful companion. As he worked, he found himself talking to Rex, apologizing for bringing him to this place, thanking him for his loyalty and courage, promising that his sacrifice would not be forgotten. The one-sided conversation helped James process his grief while maintaining the human connection that the forest's isolation threatened to erode. Dawn found James exhausted and dehydrated, but determined to make his way back to civilization and report what he had experienced. The hike out of the forest took most of the day, as James stopped frequently to document the location and preserve evidence of his encounter. He photographed the footprints, measured them with his field ruler, and collected samples of hair that the creature had left on low-hanging branches. The return to his truck felt like emerging from an alien world into familiar reality. The mechanical presence of the vehicle, with its normal human engineering and familiar smells, provided a psychological anchor that helped James begin to process what he had experienced. But as he loaded his equipment and prepared for the drive back to civilization, he realized that his life had been fundamentally changed by his encounter with the impossible. The first person James contacted was Dr. Sarah Chen, a colleague at the University of Washington who specialized in primate behavior and evolution. Sarah had been a friend for over a decade, and James trusted her scientific judgment and personal discretion. Their conversation was conducted over secure phone lines, as James was already beginning to understand the sensitive nature of what he had to report. Sarah's initial response was skeptical, as James had expected. But as he described his observations in scientific detail, providing measurements, behavioral descriptions, and physical evidence, her skepticism began to give way to fascination. Sarah agreed to meet James at a neutral location to examine the photographic evidence and hair samples, understanding that discretion was essential until they could determine the best way to proceed. The meeting took place at a small coffee shop in Port Angeles, far from the university and away from curious colleagues. James brought his camera equipment and the hair samples, while Sarah brought her expertise in primate evolution and a healthy dose of scientific skepticism. The photographic evidence was compelling but not conclusive, as the creature's ability to avoid clear documentation had been remarkably effective. The hair samples, however, provided more concrete evidence. Under Sarah's portable microscope, the hair showed characteristics that were both familiar and alien. The structure was clearly mammalian, but unlike anything in the existing scientific literature. The diameter and color patterns suggested a primate connection, but the size and texture indicated an animal far larger than any known species. Sarah's analysis confirmed what James already suspected. He had encountered something that challenged existing scientific understanding of North American wildlife. The decision of how to proceed with this information would require careful consideration and consultation with other experts who could be trusted with such sensitive material. Over the following weeks, a small network of researchers began to coalesce around James's experience. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, an anthropologist who specialized in indigenous cultures and folklore, provided historical context for similar encounters reported by Native American tribes in the region. Dr. Robert Martinez, a wildlife biologist with the National Park Service, brought institutional knowledge and understanding of how government agencies might respond to such claims. The group's research revealed a pattern of similar encounters dating back over a century, most of them dismissed or explained away by mainstream science. Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest had extensive traditions involving creatures that matched James's description, suggesting that his encounter was part of a much larger phenomenon that had been systematically ignored or suppressed. Dr. Hoffman's research into tribal accounts provided disturbing parallels to James's experience. Stories of encounters where protective animals were killed, where witnesses were traumatized and changed, where evidence was suppressed or explained away. The consistency of these accounts across different tribes and different time periods suggested that James had encountered something that was both real and actively hiding from human detection. As the research progressed, James began to realize that his decision to report his encounter had attracted unwanted attention. Phone calls from unknown government agencies, unexpected visits from federal employees claiming to represent various departments, and a general sense that he was being watched and evaluated. The pressure to remain silent about his experience was both subtle and persistent. Dr. Martinez's contacts within the Park Service revealed that James's encounter was not the first to be reported in the Olympic Peninsula region. There had been a pattern of similar incidents over the years, all of them carefully documented and just as carefully buried in classified files. The government's response to such encounters appeared to be systematic suppression rather than scientific investigation. The pressure reached a climax when James was visited by two federal agents who identified themselves as representatives of a joint task force investigating wildlife anomalies. The agents were polite but firm in their suggestion that James's research into his encounter should be discontinued, and that further public discussion of his experience would not be in his best interests or those of his career. The message was clear. James could continue his normal wildlife research without interference, but any attempt to publicize or further investigate his Bigfoot encounter would result in consequences that would extend beyond his professional life. The agents left behind a non-disclosure agreement that James was strongly encouraged to sign, along with the clear understanding that his cooperation was expected rather than requested. James's decision to go public with his story came after weeks of agonizing consideration. The scientific part of him wanted to preserve and share evidence of one of the most significant biological discoveries in modern history. But the human part of him, still grieving for Rex and traumatized by his encounter, wanted nothing more than to forget the entire experience and return to his normal life. The deciding factor was Rex's memory. James realized that his loyal companion had died protecting him from something extraordinary, and that death deserved acknowledgement and meaning. Signing the non-disclosure agreement and pretending the encounter had never happened would dishonor Rex's sacrifice and allow the suppression of evidence to continue unchallenged. James's first public account of his encounter was published in a small wildlife magazine that specialized in unusual animal behavior. The response was immediate and polarized, with believers praising his courage, while skeptics attacked his credibility and scientific methodology. The university's response was swift and punitive. James found himself reassigned to administrative duties and effectively barred from field research. The media attention that followed was both gratifying and horrifying. James found himself on talk shows and documentary programs, telling and retelling his story to audiences that ranged from genuinely interested to openly hostile. The scientific community's response was largely negative, with former colleagues distancing themselves and funding sources drying up as James became associated with fringe research. But the public response also brought unexpected connections. James began hearing from other witnesses who had experienced similar encounters but had remained silent out of fear or disbelief. Each new account added to the growing body of evidence that suggested Bigfoot encounters were far more common than mainstream science acknowledged. Dr. Chen's support proved crucial during this difficult period. Despite pressure from the university and her own concerns about professional reputation, she continued to analyze the physical evidence and provide scientific credibility to James's claims. Her laboratory work on the hair samples revealed genetic markers that were consistent with an unknown primate species, lending additional weight to James's account. The formation of the Pacific Northwest Cryptid Research Institute provided James with an institutional framework for continuing his investigation. The organization, founded by researchers who had faced similar professional ostracism, offered resources and credibility that individual researchers could not maintain alone. James found himself at the center of a network of scientists, witnesses, and investigators who were determined to bring legitimate scientific scrutiny to the Bigfoot phenomenon. Years of investigation have revealed the existence of a small but persistent population of these creatures throughout the Pacific Northwest. The evidence suggests a species that is highly intelligent, supremely adapted to forest environments, and possessing an almost supernatural ability to avoid human detection. Their social structure appears to be complex, with territorial boundaries and behavioral patterns that indicate sophisticated communication and planning abilities. The government's response to this research has been consistent with James's early experience. Funding for legitimate Bigfoot research is virtually non-existent, witness accounts are systematically suppressed or explained away, and researchers who pursue the topic too aggressively find themselves facing professional and personal consequences that effectively end their careers. James has come to understand that his encounter in the Olympic Peninsula was part of a much larger phenomenon that challenges fundamental assumptions about the natural world. The creature that killed Rex was not just an undiscovered animal, but a representative of a species that has maintained its secrecy through intelligence, adaptation, and possibly human assistance in the form of systematic cover-ups. The loss of Rex remains the most painful aspect of James's experience. The loyal dog's sacrifice has given meaning to everything that followed, but the grief has never fully healed. James visits the gravesite annually, maintaining the cairn that marks Rex's resting place and spending time remembering the companion who gave his life protecting a friend. The investigation continues, driven by James's conviction that Rex's death demands truth and acknowledgement. Each new piece of evidence, each additional witness account, each small victory against the forces of suppression and denial serves as a memorial to the dog who faced the impossible with courage and loyalty. Today, James Mitchell teaches at a small college in rural Washington. His career in mainstream wildlife biology effectively ended by his decision to speak the truth about his encounter. But his work continues through the Institute and through the network of researchers and witnesses who have found the courage to challenge official denial and scientific skepticism. The creature in the Olympic Peninsula may never be officially acknowledged, and the truth about Bigfoot may remain buried in classified files and suppressed witness accounts. But James knows what he saw, and he knows what Rex died protecting him from. That knowledge, terrible and wonderful, has become the driving force of his life and the foundation of his commitment to uncovering the truth. The forest where Rex died continues to harbor its ancient secrets, and James suspects that his encounter was neither the first nor the last. Somewhere in those deep woods, an intelligence watches and waits, maintaining the boundary between the known and unknown worlds. And somewhere in those same woods, a grave marked with stones serves as a reminder that courage and loyalty can transcend the boundary between species, creating bonds that even death cannot break. Rex never came back from that October day in the Olympics, but his memory drives every investigation, every research project, every moment when James chooses truth over comfortable silence. The dog's sacrifice has meaning only if the truth he died protecting is eventually acknowledged and understood. Until that day comes, James Mitchell will continue fighting for recognition of what he witnessed, honoring the memory of the companion who saved his life by facing down the impossible.